Section 1. The Secret Beneath the Surface. There is a show that has been running on Sunday nights and now Wednesday nights for over 25 years, and most people who watch it think they know exactly what it is. They think it is a cartoon about a fat, dumb guy from a small town in Rhode Island who gets into trouble while his family sort of watches. They think it is a series of random jokes stitched together by cutaway gags. They think it is loud and reckless and not really about anything beyond making you laugh for 22 minutes before you fall asleep. And in many ways, across many of its seasons, that is exactly what it became. But that is not what it was at the start, and it is not the whole truth of what was hiding inside the show the entire time it was on the air. Family Guy, the series created by Seth McFarland that premiered on the 31st of January, 1999, on Fox, has always had a second layer underneath the chaos. A quieter story, a more honest story. A story about what it feels like to be trapped in a life that almost fits you, surrounded by people you love in ways you cannot always say out loud, carrying ambitions that never quite catch up to who you imagined yourself becoming. Every member of the Griffin family was quietly telling a version of that story, and most viewers walked right past it because the joke on top was too loud to look underneath. That is what we are going to do tonight. We are going to look underneath. This is not a video about the funny moments. This is a video about what the funny moments were actually saying. Because the thing about good comedy, real comedy, is that it is usually about something sad. The best jokes in the world have heartbreak somewhere in their foundation. And Family Guy, in its earliest and most honest incarnation, was absolutely full of that kind of joke. The kind that makes you laugh on the surface, and then, if you sit with it for a moment longer than you were supposed to, makes you feel something that surprises you. The Griffin family, when you strip away all the noise, is a family of people who each feel misunderstood in their own specific way. Peter Griffin, the father, is a man who has never been taken seriously and has learned to survive that by not taking himself seriously either, which is its own kind of tragedy. Brian, the dog, is a person, and yes, I mean person who knows exactly who he wants to be and cannot become that person no matter how hard he reaches for it, which is a more universal experience than most of us would like to admit. Stewie, the baby, is someone who experiences the world with the full emotional weight of an adult in a body and a social role that refuses to recognize his inner life, and anyone who has ever felt invisible in a room full of people who love them knows something about what Stewie is actually going through. Meg is the show's most transparent allegory and also its most heartbreaking one, a girl who only wants to be seen, being raised by a family too focused on their own crises to see her. Lois is a woman who gave up an entire version of her life for the one she has, and spends 23 seasons quietly reckoning with whether or not she made the right choice. And Chris, the son everyone forgets to talk about, is the living proof that sometimes the kindest person in a room full of broken people is the one who gets hurt the most invisibly. All 6 of them are telling a story. And that story was running quietly beneath every season of Family Guy from the first episode through to the most recent one, sometimes deliberately constructed, sometimes accidentally honest, but always there if you were paying close enough attention. Over the next several hours, we are going to sit with that story. We are going to walk through each of these characters and pull out the thread of meaning that runs through their entire arcs. We are going to look at the show's recurring symbols, the way the Griffin home itself functions as a kind of emotional landscape, the specific episodes where the hidden story became visible for a moment before being buried again by a cutaway gag or a reset button. We are going to look at what Seth MacFarlane was actually building in those early seasons when he cared most about getting it right, and we are going to trace what happened to that vision over time. This is going to be a slow, careful examination, the kind of thing you can drift in and out of, let wash over you, follow as loosely or as closely as you like. There is no need to take notes. The ideas will find you. But before we go anywhere, let me give you the foundation. Because to understand the hidden story of Family Guy, you first have to understand why the show was designed the way it was in the first place. Seth MacFarlane was 24 years old when he pitched the Family Guy pilot to Fox in May of 1998. He had grown up in Connecticut, studied animation at the Rhode Island School of Design, and spent his early career working on animated shows at Hanna-Barbera, contributing to programs like Johnny Bravo and Dexter's Laboratory. He was young. He was working in a world that was not designed for people who thought the way he did, And the characters he created for his original short films, a middle-aged man named Larry and his talking dog Steve, had their roots in something personal. Larry and Steve were the predecessors to Peter and Brian. And what McFarland built those characters around was a dynamic he understood from the inside. The gap between a man who experiences the world directly, impulsively, and without much self-awareness, and a creature beside him who watches all of it with a mixture of affection and despair. That dynamic is not just a comedy structure. It is the relationship that a lot of people have with their own inner lives. The part of you that does the stupid thing and the part of you that watches yourself do it and knows better and does it anyway. That gap between who we are and who we know we should be is the emotional engine of the entire show. Every character in the Griffin family is living in that gap in a different way. And the humor that surrounds them is not just there to make you laugh. It is there to make that gap bearable, to let you feel the truth of it without being crushed by it. When the show first premiered, following Super Bowl 33 with an audience of approximately 22 million viewers tuning in, it hit differently than most animated comedies of its era. There was something underneath the absurdity that felt human in a way that was hard to articulate. The Griffins were messy and loud and wrong in ways that felt real rather than constructed. The jokes were sharp, but the silences between jokes carried weight. You could feel something breathing inside the show. That something is what this video is about. Over the next several sections, we will move through each major member of the Griffin household. We will look at what their surface story is, and then we will look at what the show was actually saying about them when it was at its most honest. Along the way, we will dig into specific episodes, specific moments, specific lines of dialogue that most viewers heard as jokes, but that carried a second meaning if you were listening in a particular way. And by the end of this, you will have a different relationship with a show you thought you already knew. Before we move into the characters themselves, I want to give you one image to hold in your mind as we go. The Griffin house at 31 Spooner Street in the fictional town of Quahog, Rhode Island, is a yellow two-story house with a red front door and a teal roof. From the outside, it looks like every other house on every other middle-class street in every other American suburb you have ever seen. The lawn is mowed, the windows are clean, the mailbox is upright. There is nothing about the exterior that tells you anything is unusual about the people who live there. But inside that house, every single day, there are people experiencing loneliness, failure, desperation, longing, and love in forms they do not know how to express. The house looks normal from the street. The story being told inside it is anything but. That is the image to hold. The ordinary exterior, the extraordinary interior. That is what Family Guy was about. Drop a comment below letting us know where you are in the world right now and what time it is. We love seeing where people are watching from. And if this kind of deep, slow content is your thing, hitting subscribe costs you nothing and means everything. Section 2. Peter Griffin's Quiet Longing. When most people think about Peter Griffin, they think about the laugh. That loud honking laugh that sounds like it is being operated by someone who has never heard a laugh before and is doing their best to approximate one. They think about the falls down the stairs, the fights with the giant chicken, the beer at the Drunken Clam, the absolute confidence with which Peter approaches every situation he is completely unprepared for. They think about the comedy, but underneath all of that, from the very first episode of Family Guy through to the most recent season, Peter Griffin has been telling a story about a very specific kind of man. A man who has been told, in 1,000 small ways over the course of his entire life, that he is not quite good enough. Not smart enough, not rich enough, not impressive enough, not the kind of person whose opinions matter or whose dreams deserve to be taken seriously. And what Peter did with all of that, what the show was charting from its very beginning, was show you what happens to a person who internalizes that message deeply enough and long enough that they stop fighting it and start performing it instead. Peter Griffin is not stupid. That is the thing people miss. Early Peter, the Peter of seasons 1 through 3, the Peter that McFarland was most directly controlling and most personally invested in, was not a man with a low IQ. He was a man who had learned to play dumb because playing dumb was safe. Because being the funny one meant no one expected anything from you. Because if you never claimed to be smart, you could never be proven wrong. And if you could never be proven wrong, you could protect the small piece of pride you had left. Watch the pilot episode again, Death Has a Shadow, which aired on the 31st of January 1999, and pay attention to the scenes where Peter interacts with his job at the happy-go-lucky toy factory. He is getting a safety film made about workplace injuries, and in the middle of the presentation he falls asleep. The joke is that he is an idiot who cannot stay awake at a work meeting. But if you watch the scene a second time, you notice something. Peter does not look asleep out of stupidity. He looks asleep out of complete, total disengagement from a world that has never invited him to participate as a full human being. That is a very different thing. The man has a job where he works on an assembly line doing repetitive physical labor for a salary that barely covers the family's expenses. He comes home to a house where his wife is clearly more intelligent than he is, where his dog is clearly more intelligent than he is, where his baby is planning world domination while Peter watches television in the living room. He is the least impressive member of a household that includes a diabolical infant. Every day of Peter's life presents him with evidence that he does not measure up, and every day he chooses to respond to that evidence by laughing at himself before anyone else can. That is not stupidity, that is a coping mechanism, and it is a remarkably human one. The early seasons gave us moments where this subtext broke the surface. In the Season 2 episode, The King is Dead, Peter takes over as director of a community theater production of The King and I, and turns it into a chaotic spectacle that ends disastrously. The episode is played for laughs, and there are plenty of them. But there is a scene in the middle of that episode where Peter, flush with the excitement of having a creative project that is entirely his own, talks to Lois about what it feels like to be the person in charge of something. There is an energy in him in that scene that you almost never see. A brightness. He is not performing. He is not covering. For about 45 seconds of screen time, Peter Griffin is just a man who wants to make something and is being allowed to try. The show returns to this well repeatedly throughout its run, and almost always in the same structure. Peter discovers something he is genuinely good at or genuinely passionate about, experiences a brief period of validation and joy, and then has that thing taken away or ruined, usually by his own hand. He becomes a local internet celebrity and gets canceled. He discovers a talent for fighting and loses it. He becomes a fisherman, a news anchor, a food critic, a Renaissance fair knight. Each of these adventures follows the same emotional arc, because the underlying story is always the same. Peter Griffin is a man who wants to matter. He wants to contribute something. He wants to be seen as more than the loud, round, accident-prone man who crashes through walls and laughs about it. And every single time the show gives him the chance to be that thing, it takes it away. Sometimes because of bad luck, sometimes because of his own inability to sustain anything that requires discipline, sometimes because the world simply does not have a place for someone like him in any role that might invite genuine respect. There is something almost mythological about this pattern. The story of the person who reaches for something meaningful and watches it dissolve in their hands has been told so many times in so many forms that it has its own weight. Family Guy was telling that story with a buffoon in a white shirt, but it was telling it genuinely. The relationship between Peter and Lois is where this hidden story becomes most legible. In the early seasons, Peter and Lois were written as a couple who actually loved each other. Messily, imperfectly, with frequent miscommunication and occasional genuine hurt feelings, but loved each other in a way that felt real rather than functional. Lois was not just the long-suffering wife. She was the person who had chosen Peter, specifically and deliberately, out of a field of more impressive options, and Peter knew that. He carried the knowledge of her choice around with him like something precious. One of the most quietly devastating early episodes is Da Boom from Season 2, in which Peter becomes convinced that a nuclear apocalypse is imminent and moves the family to a remote area to survive. The apocalypse happens because Family Guy is that kind of show, and the Griffins end up in a post-nuclear wasteland trying to rebuild some version of normal life. The comedic beats are plentiful, but there is a moment late in the episode where Peter, sitting in the rubble of everything, looks at Lois and says something that sounds like a joke but is not really a joke at all. He says, essentially, that as long as she is there, he does not really need anything else. That line gets about 2 seconds of screen time before the next joke, but it is telling you something important about who Peter Griffin was at his most honest. He was a man whose entire sense of security rested on one thing: the knowledge that Lois loved him. Without her, the house, the job, the friends, the bar, none of it means anything. She is the proof that someone thought he was worth choosing. This is why the later season shift in their relationship when Peter became genuinely cruel to Lois, dismissive rather than thoughtless, malicious rather than careless was so damaging to the show's hidden story. When you understand what Lois represents to Peter at the foundation of his character, watching him abandon that foundation does not read as comedy. It reads as the collapse of something that was supposed to hold. But in those early seasons, the foundation was still there, and you could feel it in the episodes that let the two of them be together without anything exploding. In Season 3's A Very Special Family Guy Freakin' Christmas, the family goes through a nightmare of a holiday day, and by the end, Lois has a complete breakdown from the accumulated stress. Peter does not fix anything. He cannot fix anything. Fixing things is not his skill set, but he holds her while she falls apart. That moment lasts about 10 seconds. Most viewers probably laughed at the absurdity of the scene that preceded it, but that 10 seconds was the actual story the episode was telling. A man who cannot solve his wife's problems but refuses to let her carry them alone. There is also the story the show tells about Peter's relationship with his own father figure. In the early seasons, Peter's biological father was revealed to be a man named Mickey McFinnigan, an Irish drifter, while his adoptive father was Francis Griffin, a severe and deeply religious man who spent most of his screen time making Peter feel inadequate. The show was direct about this. Francis Griffin was the person whose disapproval had shaped Peter's entire self-image. Every time Peter did something ridiculous and seemed not to care about the consequences, you could trace a line backward to a man who had spent Peter's childhood telling him that he did not measure up to any standard worth measuring against. The episode Peter's Two Dads from Season 5 deals directly with this. Peter discovers that his biological father is Mickey McFinnigan, travels to Ireland to find him, and eventually forms a tentative bond with him. The emotional core of the episode is not the comedy, though there is plenty of comedy, but a scene where Peter, standing in a field in Ireland, confronts the fact that he has spent his whole life trying to earn approval from a man who was never really his father, and that the approval he was working toward was shaped by someone else's standards rather than his own. That is a remarkably sophisticated emotional observation for a show that also features a baby building laser guns and a man who fights a giant chicken every other season. But that sophistication was always there. It was part of what McFarland put in the foundation of the show. Peter Griffin's entire personality, his loudness, his refusal to be embarrassed, his need to fill every room he enters with noise, can be read as the armor of someone who learned very early that being quiet and hoping for recognition was a strategy that did not work. So he stopped being quiet. Peter's relationship with his friends at the Drunken Clam tells another version of this story. Joe Swanson, the police officer in a wheelchair who lives next door. Cleveland Brown, the calm, steady man who served as the show's most reliable voice of gentle decency before he got his own spin-off. Glenn Quagmire, who is a character we will address in his own right elsewhere in this video. In the early seasons, these four men at a bar together were doing something that men in real life do all the time and almost never talk about, providing each other with the only space in their lives where they were allowed to be uncertain, unimpressive, and still accepted. The Drunken Clam was not just a bar. It was the one room where Peter did not have to be a husband, a father, a worker, or anything with an expectation attached to it. He could just be Peter. And whatever just being Peter meant stupid sometimes, mean sometimes, hilarious sometimes, weirdly sensitive. Sometimes it was accepted there without judgment or requirement. The show treated these bar scenes as comedy fodder, and they were. But they were also doing something real. They were showing you where a man who spends most of his life not quite meeting anyone's expectations goes to feel okay about himself. There is one more thread in the Peter story that deserves attention before we move on, and it is the one that connects most directly to the hidden story the whole show was telling. In the episode Seahorse Seashell Party from Season 10, the episode we touched on in the reference transcript, Meg finally confronts Peter about how he has treated her. She says, with remarkable clarity and directness, that Peter is selfish and irresponsible, and that he treats the people around him with contempt. And Peter's reaction in that moment, the way he laughs rather than feels anything, was a turning point that most viewers read as proof that Peter had become irredeemably terrible. But look at it again. Look at the laugh closely. That laugh is not the laugh of someone who does not care. That is the laugh of someone who has been laughing at himself for so long as a survival strategy, that he literally cannot stop doing it, even when the thing being said about him is true and devastating, and coming from his own daughter. The laugh is not cruelty. It is a defense mechanism that has become so deeply ingrained it fires, even when he should be letting himself feel something. Which is the saddest possible version of who Peter Griffin is. A man so practiced at not being hurt by the world's verdict on him that he cannot feel it anymore, even when he should. In the early seasons, before the show grew too broad to sustain the nuance, Peter Griffin was one of the most honest portraits of working-class masculine vulnerability that animated television had ever produced. He was funny. He was also something more than funny. He was a man who needed to be seen as more than what the world was willing to allow him to be, and who had given up on asking for it. And in the episodes where the show remembered this, where it let Peter be something quieter and more real for just a moment, those moments were the heart of the whole thing. The hidden story of Peter Griffin is the story of a man who chose joy over dignity because dignity was never offered to him, and who held on to the people who loved him anyway with everything he had, even when he was too much of a fool to tell them so directly. That story was always there. You just had to know where to listen for it. Section 3. Brian's Slow Unraveling. Brian H. Griffin is the easiest character in the show to misread. He looks, on the surface, like the straight man, the sensible one. The grown-up in a room full of chaos who rolls his eyes and offers observations and drinks his martini, and generally functions as the audience's surrogate, the one you are supposed to identify with because he sees the madness clearly and reacts to it the way you imagine you would. That is who he appears to be. But the story the show was actually telling about Brian, particularly in those first 3 seasons and in scattered brilliant moments throughout the show's entire run, is considerably more complicated and considerably more uncomfortable. Because Brian is not the sensible one. Brian is a man, and again, I am using that word deliberately, who has convinced himself he is the sensible one, and the gap between that self-image and the reality of who he actually is provides some of the show's most quietly devastating comedy. Let us start at the most fundamental level. Brian Griffin is a dog. He is a white Labrador retriever who lives with the Griffin family, drinks martinis, drives a car, writes terrible novels, and considers himself an intellectual. Seth McFarland voices Brian in his own natural speaking voice, no exaggeration, no character affectation, just McFarland talking. That choice was deliberate and it carries meaning. Brian is, in many ways, McFarland's author avatar, the character through whom the show's creator placed the version of himself he most wanted to be seen as: witty, cultured, literary, morally serious. But here is the thing about author avatars. They tend to reveal the author's anxieties more than their aspirations. And Brian Griffin, from season 1 onward, is soaked in anxiety about whether he is as good as he thinks he is. The novel is the clearest symbol of this. Brian has been writing a novel since the show began. It is called Faster Than the Speed of Love, and it is, by the account of every character who encounters it, terrible. Not slightly flawed, not a promising rough draft, but genuinely, completely bad. The show makes this clear, repeatedly and mercilessly, and the gag is always the same. Brian presents the novel with enormous confidence. The world confirms it is worthless. Brian adjusts his self-perception to account for this information for approximately 1 episode, and then goes right back to believing he is a great writer who has not yet been recognized. Now, played at face value, this is just a recurring joke about pretension getting its comeuppance. But if you sit with it longer, the Brian novel gag is one of the most honest things the show does about the psychology of creative ambition. The story of a person who believes deeply that they have something important to say, works on that thing for years, and finds that the world is entirely unmoved by it. That is not a niche experience. That is the experience of millions of people who have sat alone at a keyboard or a canvas or a journal and tried to make something that mattered and watched it fail to reach anyone. The difference between a hero and a tragic figure in that story is whether they develop enough self-awareness to understand why the work is not connecting. And Brian almost never does. He gets close, in moments. In the Season 8 episode Brian and Stewie, which we will spend significant time with in a later section, Brian admits to something real and frightening about where he actually stands emotionally. But in most episodes, Brian's response to evidence that he is not as talented as he believes is to find an external reason for the failure rather than examining the work itself. He blames critics. He blames the market. He blames the cultural moment. He blames Stewie for not supporting him adequately. He blames Peter for not caring. He blames everyone except the person with the most influence over the quality of the novel, which is the person writing the novel. This is not a character flaw being played for cheap laughs. This is the show conducting a careful, sustained examination of what it looks like when a person's self-image and their actual capabilities are sufficiently misaligned that no amount of external feedback can close the gap. Brian is not a bad dog who deserves to fail. He is someone whose sense of himself as a great writer was formed before he had produced anything, and who cannot revise that sense no matter what the evidence says, because revising it would mean losing the last thing that makes him feel significant. The drinking is connected to this. Brian's alcoholism, and the show is clear that it is alcoholism, not social drinking, but actual dependency, is never treated with the seriousness it deserves, which is itself interesting. In real life, alcoholism at the level Brian demonstrates would be disqualifying in most areas of functioning. He cannot drive safely. He cannot maintain relationships. He cannot finish creative work. He passes out regularly and wakes up in locations he did not intend to be in. Every one of these things is played for laughs, because they happen to a cartoon dog, and cartoon dogs do not really get cirrhosis. But the function of Brian's drinking in the narrative is worth looking at. He drinks when he is confronted with evidence of his own failure. He drinks when someone he wants to impress is not impressed. He drinks when his writing is rejected, when his romantic interests are not interested, when the world declines to confirm the story he has been telling himself about who he is. The alcohol is the cushion between Brian and the truth, and the show is very precise about the moments when he reaches for it. There is also the question of Brian's relationship with women, which the early seasons handle with something close to tenderness before the later seasons turn it into something much uglier. In the original run of the show, Brian's unlucky love life was one of the things that made him most sympathetic. He wanted connection. He kept choosing people who could not give it to him, or who were wrong for him in ways he could not see, or who saw through him in ways that he could not handle. He fell for women who were complicated and distant and ultimately unavailable, which is a very particular kind of romantic pattern, and one that usually says something about the person doing the falling rather than the people being fallen for. The Season 3 episode Running Mates contains a moment that is easy to miss because it is surrounded by jokes. Lois is running for school board and Brian helps with her campaign, and in the middle of all the political comedy there is a quiet scene where Brian and Lois sit together and talk honestly about what they want from their lives. Brian does not declare his feelings overtly in this scene. That is not how he operates, but there is a weight in his body language and his word choices that tells you something is there. The scene is not romantic in any explicit sense. It is two people who understand each other sitting in the same room and feeling the shape of that understanding. Brian's attachment to Lois is one of the show's most persistently interesting emotional threads. He loves her in a way he cannot and will not fully articulate, partly because she is married to his best friend, and partly because expressing that love would require him to admit a vulnerability he is not equipped to sit with. So instead, he circles around her. He defends her when Peter does not. He listens to her in ways Peter often cannot. He is present with her in a way that is more emotionally attentive than anything Peter manages, which is precisely the tragic irony. The person in the Griffin household who is most capable of the kind of emotional presence Lois probably needs is the family dog who cannot offer her the life she chose. And then there is the friendship with Stewie, which is, across the entire run of the show, the most genuinely moving relationship in the series. We will spend a full section on Stewie in a moment, but within the context of Brian's story, it is worth noting that Stewie is the one person in the Griffin household who sees Brian clearly not the impressive intellectual Brian presents to the world, but the insecure, frightened, fundamentally decent person underneath all the posturing. Stewie knows about the unfinished novel. He knows about the drinking. He knows about the gun in the safe deposit box. He knows all of it, and he stays. That willingness to stay despite knowing everything is one of the most profound expressions of love in the entire show. It asks nothing of Brian except that he be honest in the moments when honesty is hardest, and it offers in return the one thing Brian needs more than anything else: to be known and not abandoned. The episode Brian and Stewie from Season 8 is the pinnacle of the hidden story the show was telling about Brian Griffin. The setup is deceptively simple. The two of them get locked inside a bank vault overnight over a weekend, with no food, no help coming, and nothing to do but talk to each other. The episode was groundbreaking for the show in a technical sense because it is the only episode in Family Guy's history that contains no cutaway gags and no background music. Just two characters in a room, having real conversations about real things. What Brian reveals in that vault, slowly, reluctantly, only after Stewie has already seen inside the safety deposit box and already found what is there, is that he keeps a gun. He keeps it for what he describes as an insurance policy, for if things ever get too heavy, for when he cannot find a reason that is sufficient. The show treats this revelation with the gravity it deserves, at least for the length of that episode. Stewie's response, his fear, his refusal to let Brian minimize it, his admission that Brian is the only person in the world who genuinely matters to him, is the show at its most emotionally honest. And then the next episode aired, and the vault was never mentioned again. And Brian went back to his martinis and his pretension and his failed writing. And the moment passed, but the moment existed. And it tells you something definitive about what Brian's story is actually about. Underneath all the wit and the posturing and the liberal politics and the dog puns, Brian Griffin is a creature who is not sure he wants to be here and has chosen to stay because of one relationship that makes it bearable. That is not a comedy character. That is a person. The hidden story of Brian Griffin is a story about what it costs to believe your own mythology, about reaching your whole life for a version of yourself that the world keeps refusing to confirm, about the specific loneliness of being the smartest person in a room and still failing at everything that matters, and about the saving grace of having one single other being who will sit in a locked vault with you and tell you, plainly and without performance, that you are worth staying for. That story was there from the beginning. It got louder and more painful in the middle seasons when the show's other writers pushed Brian into increasingly unpleasant behavior. But the foundation was always there. Seth McFarland put himself in that dog, and what he put there was honest, and what it was honest about was the anxiety of creation and the terror of irrelevance and the particular kind of longing that belongs to people who know what they want to become and cannot quite make it happen. Section 4. Stewie's Hidden Grief. Stewie Griffin was introduced to the world as a one-year-old evil genius with a British accent, a collection of advanced weapons, and a compulsion to murder his mother. He built ray guns in his nursery. He had a contingency plan for world domination that involved mind control devices and weather machines and a global network of sleeper agents. He was the funniest and most original character on early Family Guy, and one of the most original characters in the history of animated television. He was also, if you watch the early seasons carefully, one of the loneliest. The evil genius baby concept is so unusual and so inherently comedic that it is easy to just accept it at face value and laugh at the gap between what Stewie looks like, a round-faced baby in a yellow shirt sitting in a high chair, and what Stewie is actually saying. That gap is funny. It is genuinely, reliably funny in a way that holds up to repeated viewings. But there is a reason the gap is funny, and that reason is worth examining, because it tells you something about what Stewie's story is actually about. The humor of Stewie's character rests on the idea that this baby is experiencing something, an interior life of enormous complexity and ambition and frustration and desire that the people around him are constitutionally unable to perceive. He talks to his mother, and she hears babbling. He delivers monologues of extraordinary sophistication to a room full of adults who smile and hand him a rattle. He constructs elaborate plans and executes them in full view of people who are watching him and seeing only a child playing. He is, in the most fundamental sense of the word, invisible to everyone around him except Brian. Now you can read that as a straight comedy setup. The baby who is secretly competent in a world that underestimates him. And that is absolutely a valid reading. But there is another reading sitting right underneath that one, and it is this. Stewie Griffin is a character defined by the experience of having an inner life that the world refuses to acknowledge. He has a full, rich, complicated interior existence plans, feelings, loyalties, fears, ambitions, and the people he lives with. The people who are supposed to know him best see none of it. They see a baby. They see what the role requires them to see. They do not see who he actually is. If you have ever felt, at any point in your life, that the people around you were relating to a version of you that did not quite match who you actually were on the inside, relating to the role you occupied, the function you served, the expectation you had been filed under, then you have felt something in the neighborhood of what Stewie Griffin's early character was built to express. The matricide subplot, Stewie's obsession with killing his mother Lois, is usually treated as pure absurdist comedy, and it is absurdist comedy. But McFarland gave an interview years into the show's run, in which he revealed something interesting about the original intention behind Stewie's desire to kill his mother. He said, and this is the relevant part, that one possible reading of the Stewie-Lois relationship was that Stewie's hostility was rooted in the suffocating experience of being loved in the way that infants are loved totally, unconditionally, but without any acknowledgement of personhood. Lois's love for Stewie is absolute and well-meaning, and completely without awareness of who Stewie actually is. She loves the baby. She does not know the person. That is a specific kind of smothering, and it is one that Stewie cannot articulate through legitimate means because he is 1 year old, and the social world he inhabits does not have a category for what he is experiencing. So the show roots his frustration through the most extreme possible outlet, the desire to eliminate the source of the suffocation entirely. This is obviously comedy. It is also, underneath the comedy, a recognizable emotional truth about what it feels like to be loved in a way that makes you feel unseen. The British accent deserves a specific mention here because the show eventually addressed it explicitly in the season 16 episode, Send in Stewie, Please, which is the 300th episode of the series and one of the most emotionally rich single episodes the show ever produced. In that episode, Stewie is sent to a school therapist named Dr. Cecil Pritchfield, voiced by Sir Ian McKellen, after he pushes a classmate down the stairs. In the course of the therapy session, it is revealed that Stewie's British accent is not actually his natural voice. It is a performance, a persona he constructed to feel more powerful, more distinctive, more difficult to dismiss. The episode explores the gap between the voice Stewie uses and the voice he actually has, and it frames that gap explicitly as a response to feeling like an outsider. He speaks in the British accent refined, commanding, particular, because speaking that way makes him feel less like the person the world sees when they look at him, a baby, a small thing, someone who can be picked up and put down and dressed in yellow shirts and not asked for his opinion. Writer Gary Janetti, who worked on this episode, said in an interview that the intention was never to declare definitively what Stewie is or what he is feeling, but to start him on a process of figuring out the difference between who he performs as and who he actually is. That is a remarkably adult theme for a cartoon baby, but it is also a remarkably universal one. The show was doing something ambitious in that episode, taking a character that had been around for 16 years and revealing that the most iconic thing about him, the voice, the accent, the whole posture of superiority was itself a kind of armor. Stewie's relationship with Rupert, his teddy bear, is another of the show's quietly meaningful recurring elements. Rupert is an inanimate stuffed animal. He is also Stewie's most constant companion, his confidant, the one relationship in Stewie's life that is entirely uncomplicated. Stewie talks to Rupert the way people talk to their pets, or to the empty room when they need to process something and there is no one available to process it with. He narrates his day to Rupert. He reports his feelings to Rupert. He treats Rupert with a seriousness that the adults around him probably find endearing or strange, depending on the episode. The significance of Rupert is that Stewie needs him to exist, which tells you something about how isolated Stewie is even within his own family. He needs a non-responsive listener because the responsive listeners in his life do not actually hear him. Rupert never contradicts Stewie, never fails to understand him, never relates to him as anything other than exactly who he claims to be. For a character who spends most of his existence being misread, that is not a trivial comfort. It is the only space where Stewie gets to be exactly himself without explanation or justification. The season 12 episode, Life of Brian, in which Brian is struck by a car and killed, contains one of the most genuinely distressing moments in Family Guy's history, and it is entirely about Stewie. The episode aired in November 2013, and Brian's death was treated as a real event. Stewie's grief was not played for laughs in the way the show usually handles its characters' suffering. He searched frantically through the house for Brian after the accident. He tried to use his time machine to go back and prevent what happened. He could not get there in time. And then Stewie sat with the reality that the one person in his entire world who had truly seen him, who had engaged with his real self rather than his assigned role, was gone, and the show let him sit there long enough for it to be genuinely painful. Brian was brought back in the follow-up episode, Christmas Guy, through time travel, and the reunion was its own kind of emotional release. But the two-episode arc crystallized something that the show had been building for years. The relationship between Stewie and Brian is the emotional core of the entire show, more than Peter and Lois, more than Peter and his friends, more than any other pairing in the series. It is the one place in Family Guy where love is expressed clearly, honestly, and without irony. These two characters, an anthropomorphic dog and an evil genius baby, tell each other, in actual words, that they matter to each other. And when that relationship is threatened or broken, the show suddenly stops being funny. That is not an accident. That is the show telling you, in the only language it knows how to use, where its actual heart lives. The arc of Stewie across the show's full run is from a character defined by his desire to escape his assigned role, the baby, the small thing, the creature underestimated by everyone, towards something more complicated and more emotionally mature, but also, at a certain point, something less original. The early Stewie was terrifying and brilliant because the distance between what he was supposed to be and what he actually was could contain an entire universe of comedy and meaning. The later Stewie, who has largely shed the world domination plots and the matricidal schemes, is warmer and funnier in some ways, but the electric specificity of the original conception is gone. What remains is still worth something. The friendship with Brian, the occasional moments of genuine emotional depth, like the Send in Stewie episode, the arc of a character slowly, painfully figuring out the difference between who he has performed himself to be and who he actually is, that is still a meaningful story. But the early version of Stewie was doing something more remarkable. It was taking the universal experience of feeling unseen and unrecognized, and routing it through the most unexpected possible vessel, a baby who speaks like a Bond villain and builds weather machines in his crib in a way that made the truth of the experience hit harder precisely because the container for it was so absurd. The hidden story of Stewie Griffin is the story of someone performing a version of themselves so thoroughly and for so long that even they have partly forgotten who they were before the performance started. He built the accent and the weapons and the world domination plans as a way of announcing that he was more than the world gave him credit for being. He constructed a whole identity from the materials of extreme competence, because having an identity built around competence is the only way to survive being underestimated for long enough. And somewhere inside all of that performance, the actual Stewie, scared, lonely, desperately attached to the one person who sees him, has been waiting to be found. He is still in there. The show has found him, in pieces, across its run. And each time it has, those were the moments when Family Guy reminded you that it was always about something more than the jokes. Section 5. Meg and the Mirror. Meg Griffin is the most direct character in the show, in the sense that the thing the show is saying through her is less hidden than what it is saying through any other character. You do not need to look hard to find the subtext with Meg, because Meg's story is not really subtext. It is text. It is the show holding up a mirror to its own treatment of women, specifically young women, and then refusing to look at what the mirror is showing. The result is one of the most uncomfortable character arcs in the history of American animated comedy, and one of the most honest, which creates a very particular kind of tension when you try to talk about it. In the first 3 seasons of Family Guy, Meg Griffin was a normal teenage girl. She was voiced by Lacey Chabert in Season 1, and then by Mila Kunis from Season 2 onward. She was unpopular at school, socially awkward, not the funniest or most exciting member of a family that was loud and strange and hard to compete with for attention. The joke about Meg in those early seasons was simple and relatable. She was the ordinary one, the one without a gimmick, the one who got lost in the noise of her family's particular brand of chaos. That is a real experience. A lot of people know what it is to be the ordinary one in a family where everyone else seems to have a clearer identity or a more obvious role. Meg in those early seasons was playing that note and playing it authentically. She wanted to fit in at school and could not quite manage it. She wanted her family to see her, and they often did not. Not because they were cruel, but because they were each so absorbed in their own situations that there was not much attention left over. She had crushes that went unrequited, and friendships that felt precarious, and a sense that the world would eventually catch up to who she was, because that is what you believe when you are a teenager and ordinary. That eventually is coming. The shift happened gradually after the show returned from cancellation in 2005. The jokes about Meg stopped being about her being ordinary and became increasingly and then eventually overwhelmingly about her being undesirable, unlovable, someone who deserved what she got. The transformation of Meg from a relatable teenager into the family's designated target was one of the most slow-moving and comprehensive changes in Family Guy's history, and the way it happened gradually, incrementally, with each new season adding a little more weight to the pile, is part of what makes it so disturbing in retrospect. Because it mirrors something that happens to a lot of people in real life, particularly women and girls, so precisely that it is hard to watch without recognizing it. The experience of being seen as someone whose suffering is acceptable, whose unhappiness is funny, whose dignity is an appropriate sacrifice for other people's comfort, that is not an abstract concept. That is something that happens, that has always happened, in families and schools and workplaces and communities, and Family Guy's sustained, multi-season portrayal of it, however accidental or however deliberate, was holding a mirror up to that reality. What the show could never quite decide was whether it was holding that mirror up critically or approvingly. That ambiguity is part of what makes Meg's story so uncomfortable to analyze. There is one episode that sits at the center of Meg's entire arc, and it is the season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party, which aired in November 2011. The setup is that the Griffin family is stuck in the house during a hurricane. Meg, after years of accumulated treatment at the hands of her family, finally reaches a point where she cannot hold it in anymore. She turns to her family and she tells them the truth. She looks at Peter and says that he is selfish and irresponsible and that his treatment of her has been criminal. She looks at Lois and points out that Lois uses Meg as an emotional dumping ground while demanding Meg remain cheerful and grateful. She turns the mirror on the whole family and makes them look at what they have been doing. And for a moment, a real, sustained, dramatic moment, Family Guy became the show it could have been all along. The scene is extraordinary. Mila Kunis's vocal performance in that scene is one of the best pieces of acting in the show's history, and what she is performing is not just Meg's anger. She is performing the entire weight of years of accumulated smallness, years of being told without words that her feelings were the appropriate sacrifice, years of waking up in a house that treated her as a joke. The family's reaction is telling. Without Meg absorbing everything, they fall apart. They start fighting with each other. The anxiety and frustration that had been redirecting itself onto Meg for years suddenly has nowhere to go, and it turns inward, and the family becomes briefly but genuinely dysfunctional in a new way. The episode seemed to be setting up something important, a reckoning, a recognition, a moment of genuine change. And then Meg goes to Brian and takes it all back. She tells him she accepts her role. She says that without her absorbing the family's dysfunction, the family cannot function, and so she will go back to being what she has always been. The episode closes the loop on itself in a way that is either a profound observation about the psychology of enabling or a deeply cynical capitulation to the status quo, and the show does not fully clarify which one it intends. Both readings are available. The first reading says, Meg is showing a kind of tragic self-awareness, understanding her own role in a family system and accepting it with open eyes, because the alternative, the family's collapse, feels worse to her than her own suffering. This is a recognizable thing that happens to people in real life, particularly people who learned from childhood that their job was to keep everyone else stable. It is sad and true. The second reading says, the show is asking you to accept that some people's suffering is simply the cost of keeping things normal for everyone around them, and that the correct response to years of abuse is to put your head down and go back to absorbing it. This reading is deeply troubling, and the fact that it is available at all that the episode's ending can support this interpretation reveals something about the limits of how far Family Guy was willing to go with the honest thing it was doing. What saves Meg's story from being entirely grim is that the show did, over the course of its full run, give her moments where she was allowed to be more than a target. The season 13 crossover with The Simpsons, in which Meg meets Lisa Simpson, is one of the genuinely warm episodes in Family Guy's history. Lisa sees Meg for who she is: smart, musically talented, worth being friends with, and the relief on Meg's face in those scenes is something that the show does not play for laughs. It just lets it be real. Meg and Lisa are friends by the end of the episode, and it reads as a genuine gift from the writers to a character they had been kicking around for years. There is also the season 14 episode Peter's Sister, in which the show attempts to explain Peter's treatment of Meg by revealing that Peter was himself abused by his own sister growing up, and that the cycle of cruelty has roots in his own experience of being belittled and physically hurt. The episode is not a complete vindication of the Meg abuse storyline. Nothing could make 10 seasons of it retrospectively defensible, but it tries. It gives Meg a moment of genuine empathy for Peter, and it gives Peter a moment of genuine remorse, and the reconciliation between them at the episode's end is tender enough to be felt. Mila Kunis, the actress who voices Meg, has spoken publicly about the experience of voicing a character whose abuse became a cultural touchstone. She has described people repeating to her the catchphrase that Peter uses to dismiss Meg, and this is a real thing that happened to her in public. Real people saying the words her character is dismissed with, to the real woman who gives that character her voice. The fictional cruelty had bled into the real world in a way that nobody quite anticipated. What Meg's story tells us about Family Guy's hidden story is both the most direct and the most painful part of the analysis. The show was, at its most honest, a story about people who feel unseen. Every major character in the Griffin family is, in their own way, a variation on that theme. But Meg is the character where the show was not metaphorical about it. Meg was the character where the show pointed directly at the experience of being systematically discounted by the people who are supposed to love you most, and said, this is what that looks like. This is how it happens. Gradually, then totally. Through jokes that become habits, that become expectations, that become the architecture of a relationship. The tragedy of Meg Griffin is that she is the only character in the show whose hidden story was never really hidden. It was visible the whole time. And the show could never quite figure out what to do with that visibility, whether to honor it or deny it, whether to let it be a critique or let it be a joke, and the uncertainty produced the most uncomfortable character arc in the show's history. She was a mirror. The show pointed her at the audience, and the audience laughed. What they were laughing at, if they stayed with it long enough to feel where the laugh came from, was a very recognizable picture of cruelty they had witnessed or participated in or experienced themselves, repackaged just absurdly enough to feel safe. Meg's story is Family Guy's least hidden story. It was always right there. Section 6. Lois and the life she almost lived. There is a version of Lois Griffin's life that she never tells anyone about directly, but that the show has been hinting at since the very first episode. It is the life she could have lived if she had stayed on the path that was laid out for her. The path that her parents, Carter and Barbara Pewterschmidt, the old money Newport, Rhode Island Pewterschmidts, intended for her. Lois was born into serious wealth. Her father, Carter Pewterschmidt, is a billionaire industrialist, the kind of man who has a room in his house specifically for insulting people he considers beneath him, and who has never fully accepted that his daughter chose to marry Peter Griffin, a man Carter regards as roughly equivalent in social standing to a yard tool that has learned to speak. The Pewterschmidt mansion, which appears throughout the show, is the shadow that falls over the Griffin household every time Lois looks at the mismatched furniture and the carpet that needs replacing, and the husband asleep in front of the television. Lois gave all of that up. She gave it up deliberately, consciously, when she fell in love with Peter, who was working as a towel boy at her aunt's beach club. The decision to choose Peter over the Pewterschmidt inheritance was an act of self-determination. It was Lois deciding that she wanted a real life, with all its mess and financial pressure and chaos, over the polished emptiness of a wealthy existence that had never asked her who she actually was. She chose on purpose. And the show spends 23 seasons sitting with what it feels like to have made that choice and to live with it every day. The complexity of Lois's character in the early seasons is that she is not a woman who regrets her choice. Exactly. She does not look at her life and wish she had stayed in Newport. What she feels is more complicated than regret. She feels something closer to the quiet vertigo of knowing there is an alternate version of your life out there, fully formed and accessible in theory, and that accessing it would require you to become a version of yourself you chose not to be. The Pewterschmidt world is not gone. Carter still calls, Barbara still makes comments about the house, The alternate life is right there, a phone call away, and Lois has to choose every day, in 100 small ways, not to go back to it. The piano is the show's most consistent symbol of who Lois is underneath the role of wife and mother. She plays piano, not casually, not recreationally, but with real skill. In early episodes, she gives piano lessons to supplement the family's income, and in scenes where she is at the piano really playing, not being interrupted, not having Peter crash through the wall behind her, you see a version of Lois that is different from the one who manages the household, and manages Peter, and manages the children's various crises. You see a person who found something young that was entirely hers, that no one gave her and no one could take away, and that she has carried with her through every version of her life because it is the truest thing she knows about herself. The show does not spend enough time with this version of Lois. It appears in flashes, in single scenes within episodes that are mostly about something else. But each time it appears, it adds a layer to the character that the comedy frequently flattens. Lois is not just the long-suffering wife and the patient mother and the most reasonable person in a household of unreasonable people. She is also someone with an artistic self that she has been quietly feeding in whatever time is left over after everyone else's needs have been met, which is usually not very much time at all. The episode Wasted Talent from Season 2 addresses this directly. In that episode, Peter discovers an unusual talent for piano while drunk and tries to enter a competition, in the process upstaging Lois, who has spent years developing a genuine skill at the instrument. The comedic heart of the episode is about Peter's temporary drunken virtuosity and the ways in which his accidental talent overshadows Lois's sustained effort. But the emotional heart is about something that Lois does not quite say out loud. She is someone who has spent years working at something because it is hers, and the world around her still manages to treat it as less important than whatever Peter accidentally stumbles into on a given week. This is a story many women know. The story of the sustained effort that goes unremarked beside the loud accident that gets applause. Wasted Talent tells this story as a comedy, but it tells it accurately. Lois's relationship with her parents is another of the show's most consistently interesting emotional threads. Carter Pewterschmidt is played as a villain, essentially, a man whose contempt for Peter is bottomless, and whose love for Lois, when it is expressed at all, is expressed through the language of ownership and expectation rather than genuine warmth. Barbara Pewterschmidt is more affectionate but also more absent, a woman who floats through scenes in a comfortable haze that suggests she has found her own way of not fully inhabiting the life she is living. Together they represent the world Lois left, wealthy, comfortable, profoundly disconnected from anything that might be called a real inner life. The show's most honest statement about Lois's relationship to her parents comes in an early episode where she tries to navigate a visit from Carter and ends up mediating between Carter's contempt for Peter and Peter's genuine, if clumsy, desire for approval from his father-in-law. What the episode reveals, in the spaces between the jokes, is that Lois grew up in a household where love was conditional and largely unexpressed, and that Peter's unconditional, if chaotic, affection for her was genuinely novel and genuinely attractive because of what she had come from. She did not choose Peter despite his flaws. She chose him partly because of what his flaws said about his authenticity. He was not performing wealth or sophistication or the correct kind of background. He was just himself, transparently and without artifice. And that transparency was a gift after a childhood spent in a house full of elegant distance. In the early seasons, before the show's treatment of both Lois and Peter grew significantly harsher, there were scenes between them that caught this dynamic. Peter would do something idiotic and Lois would correct him, exasperated, and then some small thing would remind her his laugh, the way he grabbed her hand, something he said without thinking, that accidentally landed exactly right, and the exasperation would soften into something real. These moments were fleeting. They were the show breathing between jokes, but they were telling you the truth of why this marriage existed and why it worked in ways that a more conventional match might not have. Lois is also, and this is the part of her character that the show is perhaps most ambivalent about, someone with a complicated relationship with her own self-control. The show established early that Lois, before and outside of her role as wife and mother, had a significant appetite for experience that her current life does not easily accommodate. This shows up in hints and flashbacks throughout the series. a past with drugs, a period of rebellion against the Pewterschmidt world that involved relationships and choices she does not fully account for. The show plays these reveals as comedy. Look, the sensible mom had a wild past, but the underlying truth is something slightly more interesting. Lois chose stability. She chose the ordinary, messy, genuine life over the polished, constructed one. But choosing stability did not eliminate the part of her that wanted stimulation, that got restless, that needed something to happen. The piano absorbed some of that energy. The chaos of living with Peter and 3 children absorbed some of the rest. But in episodes where Lois is given a chance to step outside the role, a brief career, a small adventure, a chance to be somebody else for a week, you see the relief in her. She is not a woman who is secretly unhappy. She is a woman who needs more room to be herself than the role she inhabits typically provides. This is another profoundly recognizable experience, and one that the early show handled with more grace than it probably gets credit for. The experience of choosing a life that is good and real and yours, and still feeling, sometimes, the pull of the version of yourself that got away. That is something millions of people live with. Lois Griffin was an honest portrait of that experience in animated form, and the show's willingness to hold the complexity of it without resolving it, without declaring her happy or unhappy, but instead showing her as a specific, layered person navigating the distance between who she is and who she might have been, was one of its quietest achievements. The hidden story of Lois Griffin is a story about volition, about the difference between choosing something and being resigned to it. She chose this life. She keeps choosing it. And the choosing is not the same as never wondering. The wondering is what makes her real. Section 7. Chris and the Invisible Son. Chris Griffin is the character that every comprehensive analysis of Family Guy eventually reaches and then does not quite know what to do with. He is the show's most neglected major character, the one the writers return to least often, the one who received the least development and the least screen time relative to his family members, and the one who, as a result, tells the show's hidden story in a different way than any of the others, not through what the show chooses to say about him, but through what it chooses not to. Chris is 13 years old at the start of the series. He is overweight, blonde, good-natured, and, in the show's own description, not particularly bright. His voice actor Seth Green based Chris's vocal performance on a very specific source. He has said in interviews that he imagined what the character Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs would sound like ordering at a McDonald's. The result is a voice that is recognizable and odd, slightly off the expected note for a teenage boy, which suits a character who is himself slightly off the expected note in ways the show never quite gets around to fully exploring. Chris's artistic talent is the most consistently fascinating and consistently underused element of his characterization. He draws. The show establishes this explicitly in the Season 2 episode, A Picture's Worth $1,000, in which Chris's drawings attract the attention of a New York art dealer who believes Chris has genuine artistic ability. The episode follows Peter's attempts to monetize Chris's talent, which go disastrously wrong in the way that all of Peter's attempts to monetize anything go disastrously wrong. But within the comedy of that episode, there is something happening with Chris that the show almost never comes back to. Chris is the only member of the Griffin family who has a demonstrably real creative gift. Peter's enthusiasms are always performative and short-lived. Brian's writing is objectively terrible despite his belief in it. Stewie's genius is primarily technical and destructive, and Lois's piano playing, while skilled, is as much about her personal history as about any expressive ambition. But Chris draws, and according to the episode, he draws in a way that has genuine artistic worth. He sees the world in a way that produces images worth looking at. This is remarkable for a character who is otherwise portrayed as a slightly slower version of his father. Impulsive, not academically strong, prone to being distracted. The artistic gift sits in Chris in a way that the show almost never addresses, as if the writers were not sure what to do with a character who is both funny dumb and genuinely talented. The tension between those two things is interesting precisely because it is unresolved. Chris is someone who cannot pass his classes, but can produce images that make art dealers stop and look. He is a person whose intelligence takes a form that the institutions around him, the school primarily, but also his family, do not have a category for. This is the Chris story that could have been told, the one that the show gestured toward and then largely abandoned. The story of a kid who has something real inside him that no one in his life knows how to recognize or support. Peter is too chaotic to be a useful guide. Lois is managing too much to notice. The school measures Chris against academic standards that reveal only his limitations. And so, whatever Chris's actual gift is, it develops in isolation, without support or encouragement, surfacing occasionally in drawings that no one quite knows what to do with. The evil monkey in Chris's closet is one of the show's most delightful and also most revealing running gags. For a significant stretch of the show's early and middle seasons, Chris believed there was an evil monkey living in his bedroom closet. The monkey would appear in the background of closet-opening scenes, menacing and red-eyed, pointing at Chris with malevolent intent. No other character acknowledged the monkey's existence. Chris was the only one who saw it, and his terror of the monkey was played as both a running gag and an occasional plot point. Eventually, in the Season 8 episode Hannah Banana, the monkey's backstory is revealed. It is not actually evil. It moved into the closet years ago when it discovered its wife had been unfaithful, and it has been hiding there in a state of emotional devastation ever since. The red-eyed menacing was not malice but grief, and once Chris learns this, the two of them reach an understanding, and the monkey moves on. The monkey story is absurd, completely, deliberately, gloriously absurd, but it operates as a very clean little metaphor about the experience of dreading something for years and discovering that the thing you dreaded was itself suffering. Chris's monster was not a monster. It was a creature that had been hurt and was hiding. The fact that this resolution is given to Chris, specifically, and that it arrives in an episode that ends with Chris showing unexpected compassion for the monkey's situation, tells you something about the show's intuition regarding what Chris's character could do. He is, underneath the buffoonery and the social awkwardness and the test failures, someone with a genuine capacity for empathy that the show almost never gets around to actually deploying. His relationship with his sister Meg is the other element of Chris's character that deserves more attention than the show gives it. In the early seasons, Chris and Meg had the ordinary antagonism of siblings who are close in age and competing for the same small pool of parental attention. But there were also moments, scattered across multiple seasons, where Chris showed genuine care for Meg that was absent in the rest of the family. He does not join in on her humiliation with the same enthusiasm as the adults. He sometimes, quietly and without announcement, takes her side. He is not a champion for her. He is not equipped to be. He does not have the standing or the eloquence, but there are episodes where he looks at what is happening to his sister, and something in his expression registers what it is. This is the hidden story of Chris Griffin. He is the character who sees what is happening most clearly and is least equipped to do anything about it. He does not have Stewie's technical genius. He does not have Brian's intellectual armor. He does not have Meg's eventual capacity for confrontation. He is just a kid with a drawing talent nobody fully recognizes, a complicated sibling relationship he does not know how to navigate, a father who is too chaotic to model anything useful, and a genuine warmth that the show occasionally remembers to use and mostly leaves sitting there, untouched, in the middle of an episode that is mostly about something else. The invisible son, the one who is present in every family scene, smiling his odd smile, being gentle in ways no one notices, carrying a gift that no one has been taught to see. That is Chris Griffin, and his invisibility within the show's own narrative is itself a kind of meaning. He is the part of the story about people who do not get told their story. Section 8. The town as a character. Quahog, Rhode Island, is a fictional city, but it is built on real foundations. Seth McFarland attended the Rhode Island School of Design and has stated that Quahog is modeled after Cranston, Rhode Island, a middle-class suburb in the Providence metro area. The actual Providence skyline appears in the background of Quahog shots throughout the series, the same few buildings, visible in the distance across multiple seasons, grounding the fictional town in a recognizable real-world geography. This matters because the choice of Rhode Island as a setting was not arbitrary. Rhode Island is, among the American states, a very specific kind of place. It is small, the smallest state in the Union by area, and it has the particular quality of all small places. It contains enormous wealth and genuine poverty within short driving distance of each other, has a working-class culture that developed in parallel with an old money establishment, and has a history of being overlooked in favor of the larger, louder places around it. It is surrounded by Boston and New York, overshadowed by both, proud of its own specificity in a way that defensive specificity always implies. It knows how easy it would be to be mistaken for somewhere else. The Griffin family lives in Quahog the way millions of American families live in their own version of Quahog, in a town that is not quite anywhere, in a neighborhood that is not quite anything, in a house that is comfortable enough but not quite paid for, in lives that are full and real and surrounded by a culture that does not ask too many questions about whether everything is all right. The setting is deliberate. Quahog is a place where no one needs to become anyone particular, which is both its comfort and its constraint. The Drunken Clam, the bar where Peter and his friends spend much of their leisure time, is the show's most carefully constructed secondary location. The real Drunken Clam, inspired by the fictional one, briefly existed in Rhode Island as an actual bar and even had Pawtucket Patriot Lager on tap, which is the show's fictional beer. It closed after a few years, which is very much in keeping with the show's general take on working-class leisure spaces: present, beloved, and precarious. The Drunken Clam in the show is not just a bar, it is a decompression chamber. It is the place the characters go to be relieved of their roles. Peter goes there to stop being a father and a husband for a few hours. Joe Swanson goes there to be something other than the cop in the wheelchair, to be a person among friends rather than a category. Cleveland, before his departure to the spin-off, went there to be something other than the calm one, the patient one, the one whose steadiness everyone took for granted. The bar serves as the place in the show's geography where the characters can be slightly more honest about how things actually are, because bars are one of the few spaces in American social life where that kind of honesty is allowed. There is something worth noting about the geography of the Griffin house's immediate neighborhood. The Griffins live on Spooner Street alongside the Swansons and the Browns and Glenn Quagmire, and this proximity is not incidental. The neighborhood is the show's way of creating a community that is simultaneously chosen, and given these people did not pick each other exactly, they just ended up on the same street, and what happened next was that they became the closest thing most of them have to a support system outside their immediate families. This is a genuinely nostalgic vision of American neighborhood life, and it is one that the show treats with more affection than you might expect given the amount of chaos that the neighborhood generates. Peter genuinely needs Joe and Cleveland and Quagmire in ways that are not just comedic. They are the context within which Peter's identity makes the most sense. At home, he is a husband and a father, roles that carry expectations he frequently fails to meet. At the bar or at the backyard barbecue with his neighbors, he is just Peter, and whatever Peter's failures, his friends accept them without requiring him to become someone else. The Griffin house itself, the yellow two-story at 31 Spooner Street with the red door and the teal roof, is the show's primary stable image. Almost every episode begins and ends at this house. It gets destroyed occasionally and repairs itself by the following week with no explanation. Rooms appear that should not be there and disappear again. The carpet changes color between the first and fourth season. The layout is charitably inconsistent. Rooms appear and vanish according to what the episode requires. Staircases lead to places that should not be accessible. Peter's man cave migrates between the attic and the basement depending on when you are watching. This deliberate spatial incoherence has always been explained as simply a cartoon logic, the kind of thing you accept in animation because consistent spatial architecture costs time and money. But the instability of the house's internal geography carries a metaphorical charge that is hard to entirely dismiss. The Griffin house is the container for the family's life, and that container is not stable. It does not obey consistent rules. It changes shape according to what the people inside it need from it on any given day. It is simultaneously a recognizable symbol of suburban American normalcy. Yellow, 2 stories, red door, teal roof, identical to the 1,000 houses around it, and a space that cannot quite hold its own shape. That is, in its own way, an honest picture of what it feels like to live inside a family. The house should be stable. The house should be the one fixed thing. And it is mostly stable, mostly fixed, except for the ways that it quietly is not. The rooms that appear when needed and vanish when not. The spaces that shift and rearrange to accommodate whatever needs to happen next. The Griffin house is not a reliable place. It is a place where people live, which is its own kind of reliability. The town of Quahog also functions, in the show's recurring gags and storylines, as a portrait of a community that is simultaneously connected and isolated. Everyone in Quahog seems to know everyone else, in the way of small places, but the show consistently depicts the residents of Quahog as fundamentally alone within that knowing. Tom Tucker, the news anchor, uses his public platform as a substitute for genuine human connection. Mort Goldman, the pharmacist, is a man defined by his anxiety and his loneliness. Mayor Adam West, in his extended recurring role, is someone who has been given a position of authority and responded to it by becoming more rather than less eccentric, as if the authority freed him to stop performing coherence. The town is full of people who live alongside each other and know each other's names and still do not actually know each other, which is, again, a recognizable picture of how American suburban community actually functions, and not a particularly gentle one. What all of this adds up to, when you look at Quahog as a whole, rather than as a series of individual jokes, is a picture of a world that is ordinary in its surface and strange in its depths. A world that looks from the outside exactly like what you expect a small American city to look like, and that contains, if you live there, all the particular loneliness and connection, and failed aspiration and genuine love that real places contain. Quahog is not a backdrop. It is the soil that the Griffin family grows in, and the soil is ordinary, and the soil is complicated, and the soil is, underneath its ordinary surface, asking its own version of the question that all the characters in the show are asking. Is this enough? Is this enough for a life? The honest answer the show provides in its best moments is yes, mostly, with reservations, in ways that are hard to articulate. Yes. Section 9. The recurring symbols nobody talked about. Every long-running show develops a visual language over time, a set of recurring images and locations and objects that accumulate meaning with each repetition. Family Guy, for all its reputation as a random joke delivery machine, has a richer visual language than it is usually credited with. There are symbols woven through the show that no one has written a think piece about, that no academic paper has examined, that have been hiding in plain sight across 23 seasons of a show most people think is not trying to hide anything at all. The Pawtucket Patriot Ale bottle is on every surface in the Griffin living room and kitchen in almost every episode of the show. It appears in the background of scenes that have nothing to do with beer. It is on the counter when Lois is cooking. It is on the coffee table during family arguments. It is on the side of Peter's seat when he is watching television. This is partly just a production detail. The Pawtucket Patriot bottle is a recognizable piece of the show's visual texture, easy to scatter through a background to make a space feel lived in. But the volume of it is worth noticing. The Griffin household is saturated with evidence of Peter's drinking, not in a way the show addresses as a problem, but in a way it uses as wallpaper. The beer bottle is as much a piece of the domestic environment as the furniture. This is a house where alcohol is a permanent ambient presence, and the show never calls this out directly because it is normal, which is its own kind of observation. In the world of the show, and in the real world the show is drawing from, the working-class American household with beer bottles on every surface is not a household in crisis. It is just a household. Brian's safe deposit box, the one that contains the bottle of scotch and the gun, is a location the show uses only once in its full, direct form, in the Brian and Stewie episode from Season 8. But the existence of that safe deposit box retroactively colors every episode that features Brian drinking throughout the series. When Brian reaches for the martini, when he tops up in the middle of a scene with no particular trigger, when he is drunk in places where people are not supposed to be drunk, the question the safe deposit box raises is hovering in the background. What is he managing? What is the distance he needs to maintain between himself and something he does not want to feel directly? The show never answers this question in any other episode, but the question is there. And knowing that Brian has a gun that he keeps as insurance, knowing that the drinking is not just pretension or habit, but is doing a specific emotional job for him, changes the way his earlier scenes land if you go back and watch them. Stewie's time machine is the show's most explicit symbol of the desire to undo, to go back, to change something. It appears throughout the series as a plot device, but also as an emotional constant, the option to rewind. Almost every time the time machine appears in a significant story context, as opposed to being used for the show's various adventure episodes, it is in service of something that someone cannot bear to live with. Stewie uses it most famously to save Brian after his death in Season 12. The time machine is the show's way of keeping the option of do-overs available, of not closing the door on the possibility that the worst things that happened could be made to unhappen. The show never resolves the philosophical problem. This creates a universe with a functional time machine is a universe in which no loss is permanent, which undermines the emotional stakes of every story the show tries to tell, but the unresolved nature of this is itself meaningful. The desire for a time machine, for the capacity to go back and fix what broke, is so universal and so persistent that the show keeps returning to it. The mechanics do not have to be consistent. The emotional drive behind them is constant enough to carry the narrative. Lois's piano is present in almost every episode of the show, standing in the corner of the Griffin living room, and it is played relatively rarely given how central it is to Lois's character. In early seasons, you occasionally see Lois at the piano in scenes that are not about the piano, brief moments where she passes by it and touches the keys without sitting down. The way you touch something that is important to you in passing just to confirm it is still there. These moments are incidental, not plot points. They are the show's background doing character work that the dialogue is not doing. The piano's presence in the room is a constant reminder that there is a version of Lois that the house does not have room for most of the time. The piano is the evidence that she is more than the role. It sits in the corner and the family lives around it, and occasionally someone notices it, and mostly it is just there. The thing she chose, the version of herself she refused to leave behind entirely when she chose everything else. There is also the recurring image of the Griffin family at dinner. The dinner table is one of the show's most used settings. It is the location where family conflict most frequently erupts, where the show does its most direct character interaction, where the dynamics of who has power and who does not, who gets listened to and who does not, are most visible. In early seasons, dinner at the Griffin house was chaotic but warm. The chaos came from Peter's various ideas and Stewie's threats and Brian's commentary, but underneath the chaos there was a functioning family unit. People were heard. Arguments resolved. Someone passed the food. In later seasons, dinner at the Griffin house becomes noticeably less warm, in ways that reflect the broader character deterioration across the show. Meg becomes invisible at the table, not jokingly invisible, but genuinely, persistently not asked or acknowledged. Peter's contributions become louder and less relevant to what anyone else is saying. The family at dinner, as the show goes on, increasingly resembles a collection of people sharing a physical space and a meal, but not actually a life. The warmth that dinner scenes used to carry, the sense that this was a family, messy and loud but connected, gradually cools to something that is harder to watch. The chicken fights, recurring battles between Peter and a giant anthropomorphic chicken named Ernie, are one of Family Guy's most iconic recurring elements and the subject of significant fan enthusiasm. The fights escalate in absurdity and duration with each appearance, eventually spanning multiple continents and involving weaponry and near-death experiences before ending with the two combatants limping away from each other to continue their ordinary lives. Most analyses of the chicken fights treat them as pure comedy, an escalating absurdist gag, a joke about how grudges spin out of control, a showcase for elaborate animation. All of these readings are valid. But there is a reading that sits underneath the comedy. The chicken fights are about the specific human experience of grudges that outlast the memory of their origin. Peter and the chicken are fighting because the chicken once gave Peter a bad coupon. That is the inciting incident. And from that pettiness, wars. The chicken fights are the show's most visually extravagant statement about how small slights can become life-defining conflicts when they connect to something deeper in the person who carries them, some pre-existing wound, some readiness to be wronged, some stored energy looking for a legitimate outlet. Peter fights the chicken with absolute commitment every time they meet, with an investment in the fight that is wildly disproportionate to its cause. That disproportionality is the comedy. But it is also a very recognizable picture of the way people actually conduct their most irrational conflicts, with total sincerity, with full emotional investment, with a ferocity that would be baffling to any outsider and that the participants themselves cannot fully explain. The chicken is Peter's most honest outlet. Every frustration that Peter cannot express through legitimate channels, the job, the class anxiety, the perpetual sense of inadequacy, finds its way into those fights. The chicken gives Peter a context in which his energy, his stubbornness, his refusal to give up actually works. In the fights, Peter does not lose. He endures. He takes impossible punishment and keeps going. and however the fight ends, he walks away from it intact. That is not nothing. For a man who spends most of his life absorbing the world's verdict that he is not quite enough, the chicken fight is the one arena where not quite enough turns out to be plenty. Section 10. The emotional architecture of the episodes. If you watch the first 3 seasons of Family Guy and then watch, say, seasons 12 through 15 back to back, the structural difference is immediately apparent to anyone who is paying attention to how the episodes are built, rather than just what happens in them. Early Family Guy episodes have a quality that is sometimes described as warmth, but warmth is not quite the right word. The quality is more like coherence. The episodes have an internal logic. Things that happen in the beginning of an episode are connected to things that happen at the end. Characters make decisions in the middle that grow out of who they were established to be at the start. Stories finish. This is not a profound structural innovation. It is just how narrative works. A beginning that establishes a problem, a middle that complicates it, an end that resolves it one way or another. Comedy can play with this structure, subvert it, compress it, but the best comedy usually respects it at some level. The punchline lands harder when you have earned it through the setup. The emotional beat hits harder when you have built toward it. The early Family Guy episodes understood this. The season 1 episode, I Never Met the Dead Man, in which Peter accidentally destroys the town's television cable and the family is forced to live without television, builds toward a genuine resolution. Peter learns that his addiction to television has been keeping him from being present in his family's life. The lesson is not delivered with great solemnity. This is still a cartoon, but it lands. And it lands because the episode built toward it. The season 2 Christmas episode, A Very Special Family Guy Freakin' Christmas, is another example of an episode that earns its emotional beats. The family tries to have a normal Christmas. Everything goes wrong in increasingly escalating ways, and the episode ends with Lois having a complete breakdown before finding her way back to genuine feeling about the holiday. The emotional arc is clear and the final moment resonates because the episode did the work to get there. These early episodes also used the Griffins' reactions to each other as narrative levers in ways the later seasons increasingly abandoned. When early Peter does something hurtful, the episode tracks the impact on whoever he hurt and gives that impact room to be real before the resolution. When early Brian offers advice, the episode shows whether the advice lands or does not land, rather than just cutting to the next joke. The characters were being taken seriously as people with interiors, which meant their responses to each other carried weight. The emotional architecture of the show also operated through what happened at the end of episodes. In the first 3 seasons, Family Guy episodes almost always ended with some form of resolution that felt earned. Peter apologizes for something. Lois and Peter reconcile after a fight. A character learns something, imperfectly and incompletely but genuinely. That changes something small about how they will proceed. These resolutions were not triumphant. They were messy and qualified and often left the characters roughly where they started in terms of circumstance, but slightly changed in terms of understanding. The show understood that the most honest version of emotional resolution is not transformation, it is adjustment. One small shift in how someone sees themselves or someone they love. One moment of clarity that does not fix everything but is still true. The episode Peter's Two Dads, which we mentioned briefly in Peter's section, ends with a reconciliation between Peter and his biological father, Mickey McFinnigan, that is deliberately incomplete. The two do not have an epiphany. They do not fix their relationship. They have a single conversation that is honest in ways their previous interactions were not. And then they part, and the episode knows that this is all they can manage and treats that as enough. The sadness of the ending is real. There is no triumphant reunion, but the small truth of it is also real. Some relationships do not get fixed. They get acknowledged. This is a sophisticated emotional move for a primetime animated comedy, and the show made it in 2007, before it had become common for animation to take its emotional material this seriously. The bottle episode structure, used most famously in Brian and Stewie from Season 8, is the show at its most architecturally committed. The episode locks 2 characters in a single location with no external plot, and no cutaway gags and no secondary storyline, and forces everything to emerge from the conversation between them. The structure is demanding. It requires the characters to carry the full weight of the episode without any of the usual tools. And the fact that Family Guy produced one of the most emotionally resonant episodes of its entire run under those constraints says something important about what the show was capable of when it committed to the underlying story. The vault, the physical space where Brian and Stewie spend the episode, is itself an interesting structural choice. A vault is a locked room designed to hold something safe. It is a container built specifically to protect what is inside it from the outside world. By locking these two characters in a vault together, the episode creates a metaphor for the relationship itself. This is the space where the real things about both of them are kept, safe from the noise and performance and deflection of their ordinary interactions, waiting to be accessed. When Brian finally admits to the gun, the structure of the episode has earned that moment completely. The entire slow build of the vault sequence, the discomfort, the humor of the diaper situation, the drunk confessions, the argument, the reconciliation has been clearing away the layers of performance to reach the thing underneath. And the thing underneath is terrifying and honest, and the episode knows that and lets you sit with it rather than immediately joking it away. This is the emotional architecture that Family Guy was capable of. Not just competent narrative delivery, but the genuinely ambitious thing. Building an episode from the outside in, using comedy as a delivery mechanism rather than an end in itself, and arriving at a moment of emotional truth that the viewer was not fully prepared for. The best episodes of Family Guys run the Brian and Stewie bottle episode, the Seahorse Seashell Party episode despite its troubling conclusion, the Road to episodes in their various forms, scattered individual episodes from across the run all have this quality. They are not just funny, they are built. And then, the architecture changed. The show started building outward rather than inward, accumulating jokes rather than constructing stories, filling time rather than earning moments. The emotional architecture of the later seasons is largely absent, replaced by the horizontal logic of the cutaway gag. Here is a funny thing, and here is another funny thing, and here is another, strung together by the thinnest possible narrative thread. This is not a statement about the quality of the individual jokes. Many of them are excellent, but about what happens when jokes are the goal rather than the vehicle. When the jokes are the destination, there is nowhere to arrive. The hidden story of the show's emotional architecture is the same as the hidden story of the characters themselves. Something was built with care and intention, and something happened to that building over time. And what is left contains both the original structure and the changes that were made to it, and you can still see the original if you look for where the bones are. Section 11. What the show was really about all along. We have been circling around a central idea throughout this entire video, approaching it from different angles, looking at it through the lens of each character and each structural element and each recurring symbol. Now it is time to state it directly. Family Guy, at its most honest and its most alive, was a show about the specific ache of ordinary American life, about being mostly okay in ways that do not make you interesting and not quite okay in ways that are too small for anyone to take seriously, about having ambitions that the world has no particular interest in accommodating, about loving people in a domestic context that simultaneously sustains you and constrains you, about reaching your 30s and 40s with most of your circumstances settled and still feeling, sometimes, like you have not quite arrived at whatever it was you were supposed to become. That is not a small subject. That is the central subject of most people's interior lives. And Family Guy was packaging it in a cartoon about a fat guy from Rhode Island who laughs like a broken machine and fights a chicken, which meant that the subject could reach people who would never have signed up to watch a serious drama about the emotional cost of ordinary life. The comedy was not the disguise the meaning wore in order to hide. The comedy was the vehicle the meaning needed in order to travel. This is the tradition that Family Guy belongs to, whether or not it always knew it. Roseanne, which premiered about 10 years before Family Guy and which McFarland was certainly aware of, was doing something similar, using comedy to make the emotional terrain of working-class American domestic life accessible in prime time, taking seriously the experiences of people whose circumstances were not traditionally considered subjects worth dramatizing. The Griffins are not the Roseanne Connors, but they are part of the same tradition of saying, this life, this specific, ordinary, financially precarious, emotionally complicated, deeply ordinary life is worth paying attention to. The specific form Family Guy chose to use animation, adult comedy, absurdism, gave it tools that live-action drama could not use. It could take emotional truths and package them in containers so strange that the defenses went down. You could not easily dismiss a critique of masculine inadequacy that arrived in the form of a cartoon man fighting a giant chicken. You could not fully defend against the sadness of feeling invisible and unrecognized if that sadness was being performed by a one-year-old evil genius with a British accent. The absurdity was not decoration. It was structural. It made the real thing accessible. The show's treatment of class is one of its most consistent and least discussed elements. The Griffins are working class. Peter works at a brewery. They live in a house they cannot fully afford. Multiple episodes reveal that they are renting, that Carter pays the mortgage, that the financial foundation is shakier than it looks. They cannot afford emergencies. Vacations go wrong. The kids' futures are not obviously secured. The class anxiety is present in almost every episode and almost never addressed directly, because that is how class anxiety works in American culture. It is constant and ambient and acknowledged only obliquely, in jokes about coupons and secondhand furniture and the Pewter-Schmidt's disapproval. The Pewter-Schmidts are the show's most direct class symbol. Carter Pewter-Schmidt is old American money, the kind of money that does not need to be discussed because discussing it would be vulgar. His contempt for Peter is not just personal, it is structural. It is the contempt of a world that sorted itself out long before Peter arrived, that assigned him a place and does not see why he should want any other. Carter does not hate Peter because of anything Peter has done. He hates Peter because Peter is a category, and the category is below him, and the fact that his daughter chose someone from that category is a permanent offense against the order of things. Lois's position between these two worlds, the old money world she was born into and the working class world she chose, is one of the show's most quietly sophisticated ongoing tensions. She is not fully accepted in the Pewter-Schmidt world because she made choices that the Pewter-Schmidts find unforgivable, and she is not fully at ease in the Griffin world because she carries the habits and expectations of the world she came from, which occasionally surfaces in ways that Peter finds intimidating and the kids find confusing. She exists in the gap, belonging fully to neither world, which is its own kind of freedom and its own kind of homelessness. The show understands this tension without being able to resolve it, which is the honest response to a class gap that wide. You cannot cross it once and be done. You cross it over and over, every day, in small decisions and attitudes and assumptions that you have to consciously revise or that surface without your permission at inconvenient moments. Peter's relationship to his own working-class identity is also layered in interesting ways. He is proud of it. He holds his beer and watches his football and occupies his bar stool with the confidence of a man who considers these activities his birthright, which they are. But the pride coexists with a persistent awareness that the world does not assign those activities the same value it assigns Carter Pewter-Schmidt's golf games and fundraising dinners. The working class is allowed its pleasures, but they are not treated as equally valid. Peter knows this in the way that people who live it know it, not as an articulated political analysis, but as a bodily knowledge, a familiarity with how it feels when the room adjusts to acknowledge your presence in a specific way. This is the context within which Peter's loudness makes the most sense. Louder than anyone can ignore, bigger than anyone can overlook, taking up space insistently, as a counterweight to the ways the world is always trying to make him smaller. Peter Griffin is not oblivious to how the world sees him. He has just made a decision which is its own kind of intelligence about how to respond to that vision. The show is also, throughout its run, engaged with a very American form of nostalgia. The references to 1970s and 1980s pop culture that populate every other episode of Family Guy are not just random. They are Peter's nostalgia, specifically. The cultural era of his formation. The time when things were happening that made sense to him. When the television he watched and the music he heard and the movies he saw were speaking a language he understood. The cutaway gags that reference these eras are not just trivia delivery systems. They are the show mapping the interior of a specific kind of American adult male mind, one that formed in a specific cultural moment and has never fully updated its reference library. This is not presented as pathology. It is presented as what it actually is. One of the ways that middle-aged people stay connected to a version of themselves they can still recognize. The nostalgia is not about being stuck. It is about carrying something with you from the time when the world was newer and more legible. It is, in its own way, another form of the same longing that runs through every character in the show. The desire to hold on to something that made sense before the thing you settled for became the thing you live in. The show is about all of this. Underneath the jokes, underneath the cutaways, underneath the chicken fights and the evil baby and the talking dog and the reset buttons that never let anything truly change, the show was about all of this. About the specific, unspectacular, endlessly demanding project of living a normal American life and trying to make it feel like enough. Seth MacFarlane put all of this into the show in 1999 when he was 24 years old and building something from scratch. And much of it is still there in the early seasons if you know where to look. Not all of it survived the show's subsequent history. The various pressures and cast changes and network relations and writer room turnovers and the simple entropy of 23 seasons of weekly television production. But the bones are there. The architecture holds in places. And in the episodes where it holds most firmly, Family Guy is one of the most honest things American commercial television has ever produced about the emotional texture of ordinary life. That is the hidden story it was telling the whole time. It was always there. You just had to look through the laugh. Section 12. The ending that never came. Family Guy is still being made. As of the most recent available information, the show has been renewed through what will be at least its 27th season, a deal that extends production into the 2028 to 2029 television season, coinciding with what will be the show's 30th anniversary. Seth MacFarlane signed a major deal in 2020 with NBC Universal, distancing himself from the Fox network in significant ways. But the show continues regardless, because animation is cheap to produce, and Family Guy is globally recognized, and the business logic overrides the creative logic at the scale these decisions get made. What does it mean that a show that began with this much genuine hidden story has continued long past the point where most of that hidden story was being actively told? What does it mean to watch the later seasons knowing what the earlier ones were doing? It means something somewhat melancholy. It means that the show is, in its later seasons, a kind of monument to its own former self, still standing, still producing, still visitable, but no longer quite inhabited by the force that built it. Peter's relationship with Lois still contains traces of what it was in seasons 1 and 2, if you look for them. Brian still has moments where the original character surfaces from beneath the layers of later season behavior. Stewie still occasionally does something that reminds you of who he was before the evil genius was retired. The bones are still there, but a monument is not the same as a living thing. And the question of when, if ever, a show should end, should acknowledge that its story is finished and close on its own terms rather than continuing indefinitely for business reasons, is one that Family Guy raises more urgently than most shows, precisely because the gap between what it was and what it became is so visible and so wide. The ending that Family Guy never got to have is an interesting thing to imagine. What would a final episode have looked like, made by the writers who cared most about what the show was doing in its best years? Would it have let Peter Griffin, at the end of all his noise and chaos, have a moment of genuine quiet with Lois? Would it have let Brian finish something, write one thing that was truly his own rather than the performance of being a writer? Would it have let Stewie take off the British accent one last time and just be whoever he actually was underneath it? Would it have let Meg be seen, really and finally seen, by the people who were supposed to love her? These are hypothetical questions. The show will not end on its own terms, or at least there is no current indication that it intends to. It will continue until the business logic stops making the case for it, at which point it will stop, and the ending will be a cancellation rather than a conclusion. This is the fate of most long-running commercial television. The Simpsons has been in this condition for decades. Family Guy is simply further along the same road. But the story the show was telling in its most honest years was the kind of story that deserves an ending. The story of a family of people who feel unseen, trying to see each other, mostly failing, occasionally succeeding, learning something small and qualified in the process, and then forgetting it and having to learn it again. That story deserves a moment where someone finally holds on to what they learned, where Peter tells Lois what she means to him without a joke to hide behind, where Brian sits down at a table with a blank page and stays there until something real comes out, where Stewie uses the actual voice, the one beneath the accent, and says something true. where Meg's family looks at her and really, genuinely, with no cutaway to soften it, sees who she is. That moment is the one the show was always building toward. In seasons 1 through 3, when McFarland was most directly involved and most personally invested, you could feel the show moving towards something. The characters were getting more complex, not less. The emotional stakes were rising, not falling. The family was becoming more real, not less. Something was being constructed. And then the show was canceled. And then it came back. And the construction continued, but the blueprint changed, and the thing that was being built gradually became something different, something louder and more random and less concerned with arriving anywhere. And the moment that the show was building toward retreated into the architecture, still present, still there if you pressed against the right wall, but no longer the intended destination. This is the final hidden story of Family Guy. The show itself has a hidden story that mirrors the stories of its characters. The show reached for something and could not quite hold on to it. It had a vision of who it was going to become, and the circumstances of its production conspired to produce something different. It is still recognizable as what it was trying to be. But the original self is not the current self, and the gap between them is real and visible to anyone who sits with both versions long enough. The Griffins, in this reading, are not just characters. They are an image of the show itself. A family that was supposed to become something particular and became something different instead, and that carries the shape of the original intention in its bones, in its voice, in the moments when the noise drops away and you can hear, briefly, what the show was always trying to say. It was trying to say that the ordinary life is enough, that the working-class house on the ordinary street with the imperfect family inside it is enough. That being mostly okay and sometimes magnificent and occasionally terrible is enough. That loving your people badly and inconsistently and with enormous amounts of collateral damage is still loving them. That the longing you feel for the version of yourself you did not become is real and valid, and not a reason to dismiss the version you are. That being seen, truly seen, is the thing that makes living inside a life feel bearable. That is what the show was saying. In the jokes and between the jokes, in the characters and in the spaces between characters, in the yellow house with the red door and the teal roof at 31 Spooner Street, in a fictional Rhode Island town named after a clam. Family Guy was always telling this story. Most people heard the jokes and walked away satisfied. Some people heard the jokes and felt something else underneath them and did not quite know what that thing was. This video was for those people, an attempt to name the thing they were feeling. The story the show was telling was about all of us, living ordinary lives in ordinary places, reaching for the version of ourselves we imagined, falling short, trying again, falling short again, finding each other in the falling, and staying anyway. It is a very old story. Family Guy told it in the strangest container imaginable. It was still true. If this is the kind of long, slow exploration of a show you grew up with that you have been looking for, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps this channel continue doing what it does. Every single subscriber makes the next video possible. Thank you for spending this time here, wherever in the world you are, whatever hour it happens to be for you. Take good care of yourselves. End of script. Section 13. The Drunken Clam and What Men Won't Say Sober. There is a particular quality of conversation that only happens in bars. Not loud bars, not nightclubs, not places designed to be experienced, but the quiet neighborhood bar, the one with the sticky wood and the same faces on the same stools at the same time every week, the one where the bartender knows what you drink and starts pouring when you walk in, because your arrival is predictable enough to be routine. That kind of bar produces a very specific kind of talk. Slower than anywhere else, more honest, less interested in performing coherence. The Drunken Clam is that kind of bar. It is the place where Peter Griffin, Joe Swanson, Cleveland Brown, and Glenn Quagmire go to conduct the real work of their friendships, which is to say, the work of being men together without any of the armor that men are expected to wear everywhere else. At home, Peter is a husband and a father. At work, he is an employee. At the bar, he is just Peter, and just Peter is allowed to say things that Peter in his other roles cannot. This is not a trivial distinction. The research on male friendship and communication, and there is a significant body of it, consistently finds that men in American culture communicate differently in homosocial spaces, particularly spaces associated with shared leisure activity. The bar, the sports watching context, the fishing trip, the poker game. These are the arenas where men are permitted to express vulnerability in forms they would not use in formal or domestic contexts. Not always directly, not always with clear language, but present, detectable, real. Family Guy understood this instinctively. The Drunken Clam scenes in the early seasons are some of the show's most honest character work, precisely because of what they are not doing. They are not advancing a plot. They are not setting up a lesson that the character will learn by the end of the episode. They are four men sitting at a bar, talking the way men talk at bars, in digressions and tangents and jokes that are half serious and half deflective, arriving occasionally at something real before moving on to something safer. The scene in Season 2's Holy Crap, in which Peter's deeply religious father Francis comes to visit, has a Drunken Clam sequence where the four friends discuss their relationships with their own fathers. Peter's discomfort with his father's approval-seeking is visible without being named. Cleveland's measured thoughtfulness about his own father, absent in the episode, but present in the conversation as a reference point, reads differently when you know the Cleveland show will later give him more space to explore what it means to be a father yourself when your own model of fatherhood was incomplete. Quagmire deflects through humor, as Quagmire always does, but the deflection itself tells you something. Joe is careful, generous with his words about his father, in the way that someone is careful with a subject when they have thought about it a great deal without arriving at a simple conclusion. None of these men says directly, "I am still trying to figure out how to be a person in the shadow of where I came from." None of them says, "I wonder every day whether I am doing this right." None of them uses language that a therapist would recognize as emotional processing. But they are doing the work. In the only language available to them in this context, at this bar, on this Tuesday evening, they are telling each other something true about their interior lives. This is what the Drunken Clam makes possible. It is not a space for revelation. It is a space for approach, for circling the actual subject from a distance that makes it manageable. Peter's loudness at the bar is different from his loudness at home. There is less at stake here, less performance required, and the loudness has a quality of relaxation that the domestic loudness does not. Here he is not filling space out of anxiety. He is just present, in his body, drinking his beer, with people who have already decided to stay. The character of Joe Swanson deserves particular attention within this context. Joe was introduced in Season 1's A Hero Sits Next Door as the new neighbor who moves in beside the Griffins, a police officer, athletic, charming, someone the neighborhood immediately and genuinely admires. Peter is jealous of Joe in his first appearance, jealous of how naturally competent and admirable Joe seems, jealous of the ease with which Joe's neighbors respond to him. Joe is in a wheelchair. He was injured in the line of duty while preventing a criminal from escaping, in circumstances that the show dramatizes with a kind of respect that it does not always extend to its character's most defining experiences. His disability is established clearly, present in every scene, part of how Joe occupies the world. And in those early seasons, the show does something interesting and relatively unusual. It depicts Joe's disability as one fact about him among many, rather than as the defining fact of his character. He is tough. He is capable. He has a marriage and a friendship and a career and a self-image that is substantially independent of the wheelchair. He is not reduced to his circumstance. The early Drunken Clam scenes with Joe are the place where this is most visible. Around the bar with his friends, Joe is not the cop in the wheelchair. He is Joe, the guy with the dry sense of humor, the guy who is usually the most measured voice in any given conversation, the guy who occasionally says something so accurate and so simply stated that everyone at the table falls quiet for a moment. These are not heroic moments, they are small. But they accumulate into a portrait of a person who is navigating a difficult reality with more internal resources than the situation strictly requires, which is its own kind of dignifying. The show's later treatment of Joe when his disability became a punchline rather than a character trait, when his marriage to Bonnie became a source of cruelty rather than complexity, when his friendships with Peter and the others became occasions for mockery rather than genuine exchange, is one of the show's clearest examples of its own declining self-respect. Joe deserved better than what he got in the middle and later seasons. The Joe of Seasons 1 and 2 was a better written character than almost any animated series of that era could have produced, and watching him collapse into a vehicle for disability jokes is genuinely painful if you knew him in his better years. Cleveland Brown is the character who leaves the show before it can do the same to him, departing for his own spin-off in 2009 and returning to Family Guy after the Cleveland show ended its run in 2013. The Cleveland who returns is different from the Cleveland who left the spin-off, did its own kind of damage to his character in its own directions. But the original Cleveland of the early Drunken Clam scenes was one of animated television's most carefully observed portrayals of a particular kind of quiet intelligence. Cleveland was the one who listened. In a group that included Peter, who talked over everyone, and Quagmire, who turned everything into a performance, and Joe, who was direct and measured, Cleveland occupied the space of the person who was doing the work of actually hearing what was said. His responses were slower because he was processing rather than just reacting. His observations were gentler because he was attending to the feelings under the words rather than just the words. In the early seasons, Cleveland was the bar's conscience, not in a preachy way, not in a way that made him superior to his friends, but in the quiet way of someone who has decided that the people around him are worth the effort of genuine attention. His marriage to Loretta, which broke down catastrophically in a Season 7 episode when she had an affair with Quagmire, is handled with surprising gravity for a show that frequently treats its characters' pain as a resource to be mined for comedy. Cleveland's response to the discovery of the affair is not rage or comedic overreaction. It is devastation, clearly shown and not quickly resolved. The show took the time to let Cleveland feel the weight of what had happened to him, which was an act of respect that it did not always extend to its characters. And Quagmire. Glenn Quagmire is a character who exists in complex moral territory throughout the show's run, and the hidden story of what Quagmire is doing in the show's emotional architecture is not always where you expect to find it. He is, on the surface, a relatively simple character. The promiscuous neighbor, the one whose defining characteristic is his relentless pursuit of sexual encounters. The giggity, as it were. And for large portions of the show's run, that is more or less all he is. But in the early seasons, there are flickers of something else. Quagmire's relationship with women is performed in the early seasons, slightly more than in the later ones, with an urgency that reads not just as desire but as something more anxious. A need to be wanted, specifically that is slightly different from simple appetite. In the first few seasons, Quagmire was not just a horn dog. He was someone for whom the transaction of being desired provided something specific that he needed, and the show occasionally paused long enough to register what that something was, the reassurance, impermanent and requiring constant renewal, that he was someone worth wanting. The episode Jerome is The New Black from Season 8, in which Quagmire delivers a famous speech to Brian about all the reasons he dislikes him, is the moment where Quagmire's moral intelligence, usually deployed in service of comedy or as a counterpoint to Brian's pretension, becomes the episode's center of gravity. Every criticism Quagmire makes of Brian in that speech is accurate, which is the point. Quagmire, of all the people at the Drunken Clam, is the one who sees Brian clearly. And the character who sees Brian most clearly is the one who, by the show's own accounting, occupies the lowest moral ground. This is not an accident. It is the show acknowledging something true about judgment. It does not require the judge to be a good person. It just requires them to be paying attention. The Drunken Clam as a setting carries all of this. It is where the four of them convene to be less than their roles require. And it is where, in the spaces between the jokes, the show sometimes lets them be more than their functions. It is the quiet room at the center of a loud show. And in its best moments, it is one of the most honest spaces in Family Guy's entire world. Section 14. The Road to Episodes and the Freedom of Leaving Home. There is a specific subset of Family Guy episodes that operates on different principles from the rest of the series. They are identified by their titles, each beginning with the words Road to Rhode Island from Season 2, Road to Europe from Season 3, Road to Rupert from Season 5, Road to Germany from Season 7, Road to the Multiverse from Season 8, and continuing through multiple subsequent installments across many seasons. These episodes pair Brian and Stewie together for an extended adventure away from Quahog, usually involving travel, usually involving the time machine or some equivalent device, always involving the two of them having to depend on each other in circumstances more demanding than their ordinary domestic arrangements. The Road to episodes are, structurally and emotionally, different from standard Family Guy episodes in ways that explain why they are almost universally regarded as the show's best work, even when the show was otherwise in decline. They are freer. The characters are away from the weight of their established roles and the expectations of the Quahog setting. Brian is not the failed writer at home. On the road, he is a navigator, a companion, a person with skills that are actually useful in context. Stewie is not the youngest child in a household that cannot hear him. On the road, he is the person with the time machine, the one with the contingency plans, the one whose intelligence matters because the stakes are real. The freedom of leaving home is what these episodes are really about, underneath the travel comedy and the musical numbers. They are about what happens to a character when they are removed from the container that defines them and forced to be something more flexible, more adaptive, more immediately necessary. Brian on the road is a different Brian from Brian at the Drunken Clam, or Brian at the Griffin kitchen table. Not a better Brian necessarily, but a fuller one. Someone whose qualities are being called upon rather than merely displayed. Road to Rhode Island from Season 2 contains what might be the most unexpectedly moving scene in the show's history, and it arrives without announcement. Brian and Stewie are making their way back to Quahog after a series of complications, and during a stop in Texas, Brian visits the farm where he was born and where his mother, Coco, still lives. He finds her. She does not recognize him. She is a dog in the way that dogs are dogs without human language or human memory, completely unconscious of the fact that the white Labrador standing in front of her in a sports coat is the offspring she gave birth to. Brian watches his mother for a moment. She wags her tail at him the way she would at any stranger. There is nothing in her eyes that corresponds to the relationship Brian carries with him, the one he has been carrying for his entire adult life. The story of who his mother was, or was supposed to be, or he needed her to be, she is just a dog. She is not withheld or withholding. She simply is not there, in the way he needed her to be there. The scene is brief. The show does not dwell on it, but it tells you something definitive about Brian Griffin that you did not have before. He is a creature who has been holding on to a version of his origins that does not correspond to the reality of them, and he has built part of his identity on that held story, the sensitivity, the longing, the way he reaches toward things and people who cannot fully receive him in this moment is the quiet collapse of that story. Stewie, watching from the side, does not make a joke. The show does not cut away. It just lets the moment be what it is, for the small stretch of time before moving on to the next scene. But the moment has landed, and it stays with you if you carry it. This is what the Road 2 episodes do at their best. They create conditions under which the characters can encounter their own truths in contexts that are less defended than the domestic setting. Away from Quahog, the armor fits differently. The things you are carrying become visible in the traveling, and the person who is with you on the road, who sees you carrying them, becomes more important than they are when you are both sitting still. Road to the Multiverse from Season 8 is perhaps the most conceptually ambitious of the Road 2 episodes, taking Brian and Stewie through alternate versions of the Family Guy universe, a Disney animated world, a world where Germany won World War II, a hyper-realistic world, and others. The comedy of these sequences is undeniable. The visual joke of Family Guy characters rendered in the style of early Disney animation is immediately funny, and the subsequent tonal shifts maintain the comedy through most of the episode. But the alternate universe structure does something the comedy depends on. It asks Brian and Stewie to navigate realities where the rules are different, where they do not know what to expect, where the version of themselves they are most confident in might not work. Every universe they visit in the episode requires them to rapidly reassess what is true and what is applicable, to adapt rather than rely on established patterns. This is a description of every new relationship, every new situation, every moment of genuine transition in a real life. The multiverse travel is a fantastical version of the ordinary experience of finding yourself somewhere that does not quite follow the rules you were expecting. And Brian and Stewie navigate it together, which is the episode's emotional content. They disagree. They annoy each other. They make mistakes that get them into worse situations. They also watch out for each other, share information they would not bother to share if they were not traveling in a place where the information might be life-saving. The care they have for each other, which in Quahog is often buried under bickering and power games, and the comfortable familiarity of people who see each other every day, becomes visible when the environment is unpredictable enough to require it. The Road 2 episodes work because they tell a story about what travel does to people, about the specific quality of knowing someone in the context of moving through the world with them, as opposed to knowing them in the context of the settled, known, domestic world they share. Brian and Stewie are at their best together when they are somewhere else. Which is not a judgment on the home they return to, but an observation about what shared adventure reveals that shared routine cannot. The final Road 2 episode before this video's research cutoff, Road to Vegas, from Season 11, carries a melancholy that the earlier Road 2 episodes largely avoided. It involves alternate versions of Brian and Stewie, and its plotting is more complicated and less emotionally clean than the earlier installments. But even in its relative messiness, the episode contains moments where the show's original emotional investment in these two characters reasserts itself. The reason the Road 2 episodes kept working, even when the show was otherwise struggling, is that the template, these two specific characters, together, somewhere else was strong enough to generate genuine material almost on autopilot. The love between them produced stories. That is not a common thing. Section 15. The Griffins as a Portrait of American Dysfunction. There is an academic tradition somewhat awkward to invoke in a video essay, but relevant enough to mention in passing of reading American domestic comedies as expressions of the culture's unprocessed anxieties. The family sitcom, from I Love Lucy forward, has always served as a space where American culture stages its contradictions. The gap between the way families are supposed to work and the way they actually do, the distance between the values that are publicly professed and the behaviors that are privately practiced, the comedy that emerges when the performance of normality collides with the reality of what is actually happening inside any given house. Family Guy is operating in this tradition, and in its best periods it was doing so with genuine self-awareness. The Griffins are not a satirical target. They are a mirror. The things that are wrong with them, the dysfunction, the cruelty, the failed communication, the persistent gap between who they say they are and what they do, are not exaggerated for comic effect. They are recognizable. They are the ordinary dysfunctions of real American families, given animated bodies and placed in a slightly heightened setting so that they are visible in a way they are not always visible in the real places they came from. The abuse cycle that the show ultimately attempts to explain through Peter's own history, the revelation in Peter's sister that Peter was abused by his older sister, that his treatment of Meg is in some ways a repetition of what was done to him, is the most explicit statement the show makes about this dynamic. Families repeat their patterns. The thing that was done to you becomes the thing you do, not out of malice but out of the terrible gravity of learned behavior, of the deep grooves worn into you by the people who had you first. Peter does not hate Meg. He was Meg. He was the youngest, the least impressive, the one who absorbed what came down from above. This does not excuse the behavior. The show does not ask you to excuse it, but it explains it. And the explanation is useful because it gestures towards something true about how dysfunction persists across generations. Not through intention, but through pattern, not through cruelty, but through the unconscious replication of what you were taught to accept as normal. Lois's relationship with her own parents enacts a different version of this. The Pewterschmidts are not outwardly abusive. They are cold. They are distant. They express love through material provision and social expectation rather than warmth or genuine presence. Barbara Pewterschmidt floats through the show in a haze that the early seasons hint is chemically assisted a coping mechanism of her own for the distance inside her marriage, for the life she is living inside a world she did not necessarily choose so much as accept, because the Pewterschmidt world does not offer the same kind of dramatic exit option that Lois took. Barbara did not have a Peter Griffin waiting to offer her something different. Lois's occasional emotional collapses in the show, not the comedic ones but the ones that have a quality of something real underneath them, can be read as the place where her parents' emotional model surfaces, despite her best efforts to provide something different for her own children. She is patient most of the time. She is warm most of the time. She is present in a way that Barbara was not, and she knows it. And she is proud of it. But the patience runs out, and when it does, what is left is a version of emotional withdrawal that is very recognizable as learned behavior. The cool response, the measured distance, the removal of warmth as a consequence, these are the Pewterschmidt tools, and Lois picked them up despite herself. The way everyone picks up the tools their parents used regardless of whether those tools worked. The children process the family's dysfunction in ways that reflect their positions within it. Meg absorbs. Chris observes without being equipped to act on what he observes. Stewie externalizes the whole thing into a performance of control so elaborate that it becomes its own kind of reality. None of them escape the family system entirely. They just find different arrangements within it. This is what family systems actually look like from the inside, and Family Guy was honest enough about it, in its best moments, to be genuinely illuminating. Not therapeutic, not instructive, just honest. This is how these things work. The pattern repeats. The people inside the pattern can see it and name it and understand it and still not fully escape it, because the understanding does not automatically produce the alternative. You have to build the alternative one choice at a time, in the small spaces where you can actually make choices, and it is slow and it requires sustained effort and it does not come with a reset button. The show, of course, had a reset button. Every episode ended and the next episode started fresh, with whatever was learned or changed or broken largely restored to its previous state. This is the fundamental formal limitation of the episodic American sitcom, and Family Guy could not transcend it entirely. But within individual episodes, and in the cumulative picture that the early seasons built across their 3-year run, the portrait of the Griffin family as a living, breathing, dysfunctional but genuinely loving unit was remarkably complete. The dysfunction did not reduce the love. The love did not excuse the dysfunction. Both were true simultaneously, in the way that both are true in most families, which is what made the Griffins feel real rather than merely funny. Section 16. Seth MacFarlane's fingerprints, and what he left behind. Seth MacFarlane attended the Rhode Island School of Design. He was 24 years old when he pitched Family Guy to Fox. He was 25 when the show premiered. He voiced Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire himself, 4 of the show's primary characters, including the 3 who carry the most of its emotional weight. The degree to which the show was initially a personal expression rather than a franchise product is very high. MacFarlane has described Brian in particular as a character who reflects aspects of his own personality: the wit, the dry humor, the liberal politics, the self-deprecating relationship with his own ambitions. Brian's failed writing career, the show's most sustained and most emotionally honest running joke, is not an abstract invention. It corresponds to something MacFarlane understood from the inside, what it feels like to believe you have something to say and to not be sure whether what you are saying has worth. The anxiety of creation, the specific fear that belongs to people who build their identity around their creative output. What are you if the output is not good enough? MacFarlane was working in animation, which is a form that does not always receive the critical attention it deserves. He was making an adult animated comedy for Fox in an era when The Simpsons was the only prior example of that format achieving serious cultural weight. He was a young man building something ambitious in a medium that was not always taken seriously, and the characters he created carried the imprints of that position. Characters who were reaching for recognition in a world that offered it conditionally, characters whose intelligence and worth were perpetually undervalued or misunderstood, characters who performed certainty as a cover for profound uncertainty. The early episodes of Family Guy are full of MacFarlane's own sensibility, a deep fluency in mid-20th century American entertainment, a genuine affection for musical theater and jazz standards, an interest in the ways that comedy can carry weight that it is not supposed to be able to carry. The show's occasional musical sequences, more common in the early seasons, distributed throughout the run, are not just moments of stylistic variety. They are evidence of a creator who loved the tradition he was working within and wanted to pay homage to it while also doing something new with it. The MacFarlane who pitched Family Guy in 1998 had something to prove. He was a young person in a competitive field trying to establish himself, and the things he put into the show in those early years, the genuine warmth for the characters, the emotional honesty about ordinary American life, the care with which each character's psychology was constructed, reflect the investment of someone who needed this to work and who brought everything they had to making it work. As the show's success grew, and as MacFarlane's profile expanded beyond Family Guy into other projects: American Dad, The Cleveland Show, his film career beginning with Ted in 2012, The Orville beginning in 2017, his involvement in Family Guy's day-to-day creative decisions diminished. This is simply the reality of professional success. It pulls you in multiple directions. McFarland still voices the characters. He is still listed as creator and executive producer. His name is still on the show in every meaningful sense. But the show that exists today is not being made primarily from his current creative engagement. It is being made from the template he established, maintained by other writers who understand that template with varying degrees of fidelity to the original intention. What this means for the hidden story we have been tracing throughout this video is complex. The story the show is telling in its earliest years, the one about ordinary American lives and the specific ache of them, was coming directly from McFarland's creative imagination, from his own experience of things and his own understanding of what his characters were carrying. As that direct involvement decreased, the story became less personal and therefore less specific. Less specific meaning is not quite as precise, not quite as true. It can be executed competently and often is, but it does not have the particularity of something that came from inside a specific person's experience. The episodes of later Family Guy that feel most like the early show, the ones that break from the standard formula and commit to a single emotional idea and follow it through, are the ones where McFarland's original template is being executed by someone who has really absorbed it. The bottle episode Brian and Stewie from Season 8 feels like early Family Guy, not because McFarland directed it or co-wrote it in any unusual way, but because whoever wrote it had internalized what the show was actually about and made something in that spirit. Those episodes are the show at its most honest about its own hidden story. They are rarer than they should be, but they exist in every season through the middle of the run, and they are the places where the show remembers itself. McFarland's fingerprints on the show are also visible in its political commitments, which have remained relatively consistent across its entire run, even as other aspects of the show evolved or regressed. Family Guy has always been liberal in its political orientation, skeptical of authority, sympathetic to marginalized experiences, openly critical of religious conservatism, broadly supportive of civil liberties. This was McFarland's politics made into narrative content, and it attracted an audience that shared those politics and alienated an audience that did not. The political content of Family Guy is one of its most discussed elements, but its significance is perhaps less in the specific positions it takes than in what it reveals about the show's understanding of its characters. A show that is politically liberal, in the American sense, is a show that is arguing, at some level, that ordinary people's experiences and well-being matter, that institutional power should be held to account, that the circumstances of your birth should not determine the ceiling of your life. These are the politics of the show's world, and they are consistent with the hidden story the show has been telling. A story about people whose ordinary lives contain real significance, even though the world they inhabit does not always recognize that significance. McFarland left behind a show that is, even in its diminished later form, still recognizable as the thing he built. The bones are there. The characters are still doing things that make internal sense, given who they were established to be, however battered their consistency has become. The setting still has the feeling he gave it. And the template, even when it is not being used fully or well, is available to anyone with enough creative investment to actually use it. That is his legacy on the show. Not the individual brilliant moments, though he was responsible for many of them. Not the iconic characters, though he created all of them. His legacy is the template, the structure that allowed something honest about American domestic life to be expressed through the vehicle of a cartoon about a family in Rhode Island with a talking dog and an evil baby, and to be felt as true by the 22 million people who watched the first episode and all the people who have watched it in the years since. Section 17. The reset button and what it costs. Family Guy uses a narrative device that television academics call negative continuity. The tendency to reset the status quo at the end of each episode rather than allowing character growth or plot development to accumulate across episodes. Someone dies and comes back. Something is learned and then forgotten. A relationship shifts and then restores itself. The reset button is pressed, and next week we start again from the same position we were in before. This is not unique to Family Guy. It is, in fact, the dominant structure of American episodic television for most of its history. The episodic sitcom depends on characters whose situation remains fundamentally stable across episodes because the show's contract with the audience is that you can watch any single episode without needing context from the ones before it. This makes the show accessible and comfortable and reliably deliverable, and it is absolutely lethal to the project of telling an ongoing story about character growth. The cost of the reset button is most visible in the Family Guy episodes where something important happens and the show commits to it fully, and then the following episode acts as if nothing changed. We have discussed the most famous example of this: Brian's death in the season 12 episode Life of Brian, followed by his resurrection 2 episodes later in Christmas Guy. The death and resurrection arc is the show's most visible exercise of the reset button because it was done publicly, with significant media coverage, and because the audience's emotional investment in the event was real enough to produce genuine grief, followed by genuine anger when the reset was performed. But the reset button costs more in the episodes where the thing being reset is smaller and quieter and more genuinely earned. The reconciliation between Peter and Meg in Peter's Sister, which we have discussed as one of the show's most emotionally honest moments, that reconciliation is reset by the next episode without comment or acknowledgement. The breakthrough that happens in the vault in Brian and Stewie is never referenced again. The moment when Meg confronts her family in Seahorse Seashell Party ends with a reset that the episode frames as necessary, but that costs something real. Each of these resets is a tiny death. The thing that was learned is unmade. The growth that was earned is returned. The character is restored to the position they were in before the episode, slightly diminished by the knowledge that what they discovered in the episode will not be held. This is the structural tragedy of the show's hidden story. The story was being told in an episodic container that did not have room to hold it. You can tell a story about people learning to love each other better inside a format that resets, but the love cannot accumulate. It has to be discovered fresh in each episode that attempts it, which means the discovery gets lighter each time, and eventually the weight of the reset overwhelms the possibility of discovery altogether. The early seasons of Family Guy were better at disguising this limitation than the later seasons, because the early seasons had more episodes that built toward genuinely earned resolutions that felt true even if they would be undone. A resolution that is reset still happened. The moment still occurred. Peter still held Lois while she cried after the Christmas nightmare. Brian still admitted the truth in the vault. Meg still confronted her family and said what needed to be said. These things happened, and the fact that they were followed by a reset does not entirely erase them. They exist in the show's record. They are part of what the show is, but they are not enough. The hidden story the show was telling deserved more than these scattered, preserved moments between resets. It deserved the thing that good long-form storytelling provides: the weight of accumulated consequence. The sense that what happens matters because it changes what comes after. The show was not structured to provide that, and so the hidden story lives in fragments, in individual scenes and episodes rather than in any continuous, unbroken arc. This is the honest limitation of Family Guy's project, and acknowledging it does not diminish the work the show did within those limitations. Some of the most moving moments in the show's history are moments that were immediately followed by a reset, which means that the emotional work was done without the safety net of continuity. The truth was told knowing it would be unsaid the next week. The love was expressed knowing the format would forget it. There is something almost heroic in that, in a small way. The show made real things happen inside a structure that was constitutionally unable to remember them. The reset button costs, but the things that happened before the reset were still worth doing. Section 18. What we carry away. We began this video in the Griffin house on Spooner Street, looking at the yellow exterior with the red door and asking what was inside. We have been inside now for several hours, moving from room to room, character to character, theme to theme. We have looked at Peter's armor and what it protects. We have looked at Brian's unfinished novel and what it represents. We have looked at Stewie's accent and what it covers. We have looked at Meg's face when she is not being looked at and what it reveals. We have looked at Lois at the piano and what the piano means. We have looked at Chris in the corner of the room where no one is looking. What do we carry away from all of this? The first thing is probably the simplest. Family Guy, in its best moments, was a show made by a specific person who cared about specific things, and the caring produced something that was true in ways that the caring always tends to produce. The show was about ordinariness, dignified, about the lives that are not the subjects of dramas or heroic narratives being treated for 22 minutes a week as if they contained enough to be worth watching. That is a generous act, and it was made more generous by the fact that the show could reach people who would never have signed up for a straightforwardly serious examination of the same territory. The comedy was the permission structure. It said, "You are allowed to feel something here because it is also funny." It said, "The thing that moves you does not have to be presented solemnly in order to be real. The laugh and the ache can happen at the same time." That is, in fact, often how they happen in real life. You laugh at the joke your father makes about something that happened to him, and the laugh is real, and so is the ache, and the two do not cancel each other out. The second thing we carry away is perhaps more personal to each person who has spent time with this show. There is probably a specific Griffin family member whose story has followed you the way stories follow us, the ones that find us at the right moment and stay. The Peter story is for people who have learned to laugh at themselves as a survival technique and are wondering whether there was another option. The Brian story is for people who have built their identity around the work they are going to do and are living with the gap between that work and what they have actually produced. The Stewie story is for people who have felt perpetually misread by the world they inhabit and have found a performance that lets them survive the misreading. The Meg story is for people who know what it is to be the one whose suffering is acceptable, who are still deciding whether to accept it. The Lois story is for people living at the intersection of two versions of who they are. The Chris story is for the quiet ones in the corner who see more than anyone thinks they see. One of these will be yours, maybe more than one. The show scattered these stories across a cartoon and left them there for the people who would need them. Some people never find them. Some people find them at 20, and some at 40, and some much later than that, going back to a show they watched as a teenager and finding something in it that was not available to them the first time. The third thing is the one about art and what it does with limitation. Family Guy was limited by its format, its network, its commercial imperatives, its own declining investment in the hidden story as the years went on. And still the story is there. Still the bones are visible. Still the episodes from the best years hold up under close examination as genuinely made things. Things with intention and craft and feeling in them. The limitations did not prevent the work from being real. They just shaped what the work could be. This is true of all creative work, all of it, without exception. Every piece of art is made under constraints of form, of medium, of circumstance, of the maker's own incomplete abilities. The constraints do not invalidate the work. They are the conditions under which the work is possible. Family Guy was made under significant constraints, and some of what it made inside those constraints was extraordinary. The extraordinary things exist. They happened. They are on record. The fourth thing we carry away is the experience of having spent this time inside a story that most people walk past. There is something that happens when you look closely at a thing you thought you already knew and find more inside it than you expected. It is a specific kind of pleasure, the pleasure of depth, of finding that the surface was not all there was, of discovering that something made room for you without advertising that it had done so. Family Guy made room, in its jokes and in the spaces between its jokes, in its characters and in what its characters were carrying without being able to say so directly, in its setting and in the symbolic weight of the things that appeared and reappeared and accumulated meaning across 2 decades of television production. It made room for the honest story of how it feels to live an ordinary American life and want more from it than you can quite name, to love imperfectly and be loved imperfectly, and keep showing up anyway. That is the story it was telling the whole time. It is still being told, in fragments, in the episodes where someone remembers what the show was built to do. And it was always there, in the bones of the building, waiting for the people who needed it to find it. You found it. Thank you for being here. If this kind of deep, slow, atmospheric analysis is the kind of thing you come here for, the single most useful thing you can do is subscribe. It genuinely makes the difference between this channel continuing and not continuing, and it costs you nothing except a few seconds. Every subscriber is part of what makes it possible to keep making these long, careful videos. Thank you, wherever you are in the world, whatever hour it is for you. Rest well. End of script. Section 19. The show's relationship with its own history. One of the stranger qualities of a show that has run for as long as Family Guy is the relationship it develops with its own past. After a certain number of seasons, a long-running show becomes aware of itself as a piece of cultural history. It starts making references to its own earlier episodes. Characters occasionally acknowledge facts about their own fictional existence. The show becomes a kind of archaeologist of its own archive, excavating old moments and holding them up for recognition. Family Guy does this with particular frequency and in a particular key. It references its own cancellation and revival constantly. It makes jokes about the passage of time and the improbability of still being on the air. It has characters break the fourth wall to acknowledge that they are animated, that the writers have changed, that the show is aware of its own reputation as something that was better earlier. This self-awareness is, depending on the moment, genuinely funny or genuinely deflective or both at once. But what the show rarely does is sit with the question its self-awareness raises. If you know you were better in the early seasons, why did you change? If the characters are aware that they have become less nuanced, less warm, less specific, why do they keep being what they became instead of what they were? The fourth wall jokes about the show's decline are a way of acknowledging the decline without taking responsibility for it. They say, yes, we know this happened. They do not say, here is what we are going to do about it. This is a very human response to the awareness of having drifted from something you valued. You acknowledge the drift. You make a joke about the drift. You do not necessarily do the work of closing the distance back to where you started, because that work is harder than the acknowledgement. Family Guy, as an institution, is caught in the same pattern that afflicts its characters, aware of the gap between what it is and what it was, unable or unwilling to fully close it. The Back to the Pilot episode from Season 10, Back to the Pilot, is the clearest example of this. Brian and Stewie travel back in time to the very first episode of Family Guy, observing it from the inside. The episode is genuinely inventive and contains real comedy. But it also allows the show to observe the difference between the first episode and the current one directly, to hold up the original against the copy, and the observation it makes is gently self-deprecating. The first episode's characters were different. They moved differently. They talked differently. There was something in them that the current versions do not quite replicate. The episode makes this observation and then ends. Because what else can it do? It cannot fix the gap by observing it. The observation is the limit of the show's capacity for self-correction, which is the same limit that characters encounter in their own development. The awareness of a problem and the resolution of a problem are two entirely different things, and the distance between them is where most of the real work is. The show's relationship with its own history also manifests in the way it treats its characters' pasts. Family Guy has always relied heavily on flashbacks, cutaway gags that reveal something from a character's history, usually played for comedy but occasionally for character depth. These flashbacks are notoriously inconsistent. The same event from Peter's past will be depicted differently in different seasons. Continuity is not a priority. What is true in one episode may be contradicted in another. This inconsistency is sometimes chalked up to the show's general disinterest in internal logic, its preference for the joke over the correct timeline, and that is part of it. But the inconsistency also creates something interesting. A character whose past is genuinely unstable, genuinely capable of being revised, genuinely multiple. Peter's childhood, in the show's memory, is not a fixed thing. It is a set of available stories that can be deployed when useful and quietly set aside when not, which is actually not so different from the way real memories work. We do not have fixed pasts. We have narratives we tell about our pasts, and those narratives shift depending on what we need them to explain. The show was not intentionally making this observation about memory and identity, but the structure of its storytelling produces it anyway. The Griffin family does not have a stable history. They have a history that is constantly being revised in service of the present, which is truer to the experience of families in memory than any consistent timeline would have been. Section 20. Peter Griffin in the American literary tradition. This is a section I want to hold carefully, because the argument I am making here is a large one, and I do not want to overstate it. But I think it is worth making. Peter Griffin belongs to a tradition in American storytelling that predates animated television by several decades. It is the tradition of the lovable, well-meaning, fundamentally limited American everyman who serves as a vehicle for the culture's examination of its own contradictions. Willie Loman in Death of a Salesman, Archie Bunker in All in the Family, Ralph Cramden in The Honeymooners, Homer Simpson in The Simpsons. The specific names differ, the specific circumstances vary enormously, but the figure is recognizable. A man of the working or middle class, with aspirations that exceed his circumstances, whose failures illuminate something true about the society that produced him. Peter Griffin is in this company. He is a coarser, louder, more extreme version of the type than any of his predecessors, because he was built for a different comedic register adult animation in the era of South Park and The Simpsons, a register that allowed for more explicit and more aggressive comedy than any of the earlier formats. But the underlying architecture is the same. Willy Loman's failure was his inability to accept a vision of himself that was not shaped by the mythology of the American dream, the dream that promised that a man who worked hard and was well-liked could achieve anything. Peter Griffin's failure is more diffuse, less tragic in form but similar in essence. He was sold a vision of American manhood that promised respectability and recognition to the man who filled his role correctly, who worked and provided and was present, and he has filled that role, as well as his limitations allow, and the respectability and recognition have not materialized in any form that satisfies him. Archie Bunker, the archetype against which Peter is most frequently measured, was the creature of a specific historical moment, the late 1960s and early 1970s, when the white, working-class American man was experiencing a genuine cultural displacement, watching the world he understood reorganize itself around values he did not share. Archie's bigotry was the show's vehicle for examining that displacement honestly. All in the Family, in its best moments, was not laughing at Archie. It was using Archie to make visible the fears and resentments and legitimate grievances of a demographic that was not being heard in the official culture of the time. Family Guy's engagement with similar material is less politically pointed and more emotionally broad, because the era of its creation is different, and the specific cultural anxieties are different. But Peter Griffin, like Archie Bunker, is being used to illuminate something true about the American working-class man's relationship to a culture that does not quite have a place for him in any form he recognizes as dignified. The comedy is different. The cultural moment is different. The underlying question, what does this kind of man do in a world that has moved past him, is the same. The difference, and it is a significant one, is that Family Guy was more interested in loving Peter than All in the Family was in loving Archie. Archie was a target, at least part of the time a vehicle for critique, for exposure, for the discomfort that comes with recognition. Peter was built to be loved, however imperfectly he behaved, however far he fell from what he should be. The show's original emotional contract with the audience was affection rather than critique. You were supposed to love Peter even when he was wrong, especially when he was wrong. This distinction matters for the hidden story. Family Guy was not, at its core, a satire. It was an affectionate portrait. It looked at its working-class American family and said, these people, specifically and imperfectly and wholly, are worth watching, not as examples of what not to be, not as vehicles for cultural criticism, as people, as the kind of people you might know, or be, or come from, as the kind of people who deserve to have their story told. That is the most generous and the most honest thing the show ever did, and it did it most consistently in those first 3 seasons when McFarland was most directly in charge and most personally invested. The affection was real. The portrait was honest. The story it was telling was one that a lot of people needed to be told. Section 21. The things that do not change. We are near the end of our time together in this video, and I want to spend a few minutes on something that has been present throughout our exploration but has not been named directly yet. I want to talk about what does not change in Family Guy, even across all the seasons, even through all the character deterioration and the narrative drift and the loss of warmth that the later seasons produced. Because there are things that do not change. There are elements of the show that persist unaltered from the first episode through the most recent season, and these persistent elements carry meaning precisely because of their persistence. The house does not change. 31 Spooner Street is still the same house. It was in 1999, yellow 2 stories, red door, teal roof, green couch in the living room. Its internal geography shifts, its rooms appear and disappear, but its exterior is the same fixed image that opens and closes episodes across the entire run. Whatever has changed inside the show, the house endures. It is the stable image at the center of all the instability. Lois's love for Peter does not change. Whatever happens in individual episodes, whatever cruelty is enacted, whatever failures accumulate, the fundamental orientation Lois toward Peter, Peter toward Lois remains. They chose each other. They keep choosing each other. The show does not always dramatize this choice in ways that honor it, but it has never revoked it. Their marriage is still their marriage. Whatever that marriage has become, it started as a love story, and it has never fully stopped being one. The friendship between Brian and Stewie does not change. It gets tested, repeatedly, and sometimes savagely, but it holds. Stewie still loves Brian in a way he loves no one else. Brian still needs Stewie in a way he needs nothing else. The show has understood this from early on and has never entirely abandoned it. In even the most disappointing later seasons, the episodes that focus on the two of them together are reliably better than the episodes that do not, because the thing between them is still there, still functioning, still generating real feeling. The show's basic affection for its characters, battered as it has become, does not entirely vanish. Even in episodes where the characters are at their worst, Peter at his cruelest, Brian at his most insufferable, Quagmire at his most callous, there are moments where something softens. Some edge of genuine care for these people surfaces through the comedy. The show has not stopped caring about them. It has become careless about how that care is expressed. And in the later seasons, the carelessness has sometimes curdled into what looks like contempt. But underneath the contempt, the affection is still there. You can feel it in the moments when it surfaces. These things that do not change are the show's truest statement about itself. Whatever happened to Family Guy across its run, the cast changes, the network tensions, the creative drift, the decline in ratings, the increasing reliance on shock and randomness over story and character, the house is still standing. The love story is still standing. The friendship is still standing. The basic caring for these people is still present. That is not nothing. In a show that has been producing weekly television for over 25 years, that is actually quite a lot. The things that were built with the most care and the most genuine feeling were sturdy enough to survive everything that was done to them afterward. The foundation held. And the story the show was telling about ordinary American life, the hidden story we have been excavating throughout this entire video, that story is still there too. In the bones of the building, in the moments when the show stops being clever and just looks directly at the people it is supposed to be about, the story is still being told. Imperfectly, incompletely, with long stretches of silence between the honest moments. But it is still there. If you know where to look, if you are patient enough to wait for it, if you have spent enough time inside the yellow house with the red door that you know where the quiet room is, the one where the truest things have always been kept. If you have stayed with this for the full length of it, thank you. Genuinely. Videos like this one take a long time to put together, and knowing that someone spent this kind of time with it means everything. If you found something here that felt true to you, or that made you think about a show you love in a new way, consider sharing it with someone else who might want to take the same journey. Subscribe if you have not already. It is the thing that makes more of this possible. And wherever you are in the world, whatever hour it is, whatever weight you are carrying tonight, rest well. Take good care of yourself. You found the quiet room. That means something. End of script. Additional notes. The supporting cast and their silent stories. When we examine the hidden story of Family Guy, it is tempting to focus entirely on the Griffin household and forget that the show built an entire ecosystem of secondary characters around them, characters whose appearances across hundreds of episodes also accumulated meaning, also carried emotional weight, also told their own version of the show's deeper story. Glenn Quagmire is perhaps the most surprising figure when you approach him with the show's hidden story in mind. On his surface, Quagmire is a one-note character. His note is lechery, delivered with a specific rhythm and vocabulary that became one of the show's most quotable contributions to American pop culture. The catchphrases became cultural artifacts. The character became a symbol of a particular kind of male behavior. Most analysis of Quagmire begins and ends here. But the show gave Quagmire backstory over the years that complicates the simple reading considerably. His father, revealed in a later season, is transgender, a military veteran who comes out and transitions, which Quagmire accepts with more grace than the audience might expect from a character whose surface personality does not obviously accommodate that kind of acceptance. His sister, revealed in another episode, is in an abusive relationship that Quagmire takes violent and decisive action to end. His depth of genuine, loyal friendship with Peter and Joe and Cleveland is one of the show's most consistent facts. There is a Quagmire underneath the catchphrase, and the show has occasionally found him. That Quagmire is someone whose relationship with women, whatever its many failures, comes from a place of genuine appetite for connection that his chosen methods reliably undermine. He is someone whose protectiveness toward the people he loves is real and fierce and largely unexpressed through language, because Quagmire does not do language the way Brian does. He expresses his care through action, through loyalty, through the consistent showing up that is its own form of love, even when the showing up is imperfect. The episode in which Quagmire helps his sister leave her abusive partner is one of the best character episodes the show produced for a secondary character. It gives Quagmire a moral seriousness that his usual characterization deliberately obscures, and it does so without requiring him to abandon who he is. He is still Quagmire in that episode. He is also, in that episode, someone who knows something about what it means to love a person who is being hurt and not be able to look away. Joe Swanson's marriage to Bonnie is another secondary storyline that the show treated with more complexity than it sometimes gets credit for. Bonnie was pregnant for most of the show's early run, so pregnant, so consistently, that the pregnancy became a running gag, and the joke masked what was actually a portrait of a marriage under sustained unusual stress. Joe's disability meant that the marriage had challenges that most television marriages do not acknowledge. Bonnie's pregnancy meant that she was, for years, physically dependent in ways that complicated her autonomy. The two of them were circling something that the show was not quite willing to look at directly until later seasons, when their marital strains became explicit. The moment when Bonnie considers leaving Joe, when the years of difficulty have worn down the partnership in ways that the disability storyline had hinted at all along, is one of the show's most mature secondary plot developments. It acknowledges that love, even genuine love, can be worn down by circumstances that are nobody's fault. That the person you chose can be the right person and still become someone you cannot sustain your relationship with because the circumstances around you have changed both of you in incompatible directions. The Drunken Clam regulars, the bartender, the various background figures who have inhabited that space across seasons provide the setting's texture and continuity in ways that are not narratively explicit but that contribute to the feeling that this place is real. The Drunken Clam works as a setting because it feels inhabited across time, because the walls have accumulated the kind of character that walls accumulate when the same people sit in front of them for years. This is one of the smaller hidden achievements of the show's world building. Places in Family Guy feel like they have history, even when the show's own continuity cannot fully account for that history. Mayor Adam West, voiced by the actual Adam West until his death in 2017, was one of the show's most consistently and weirdly effective recurring characters. His role in the show was to be a figure of authority who had been so thoroughly emptied of the coherence that authority requires that his continued position in it became the joke. He was the mayor of a town, which implied responsibility and competence, and he approached both with a total and serene indifference that made every interaction involving civic governance into a kind of comedy about institutional failure. But West played the character with something that transcended simple absurdism. There was a dignity to Mayor West, a genuine, unhurried dignity that made him something more than a punchline. He was not embarrassed by himself. He was not performing the gap between his role and his behavior. He was simply himself, completely, in a way that most characters on the show are not. Whatever Mayor West was doing in any given scene, he was doing it with full commitment, and the full commitment made him, paradoxically, one of the more grounded figures in a show full of people who were performing versions of themselves. His death in 2017, and the show's handling of it, retiring the character rather than recasting, was one of the few moments in Family Guy's later history where the show's default impulse to joke about everything yielded to genuine respect. The character Adam West played was beloved because of the actual person behind the voice, and the show understood that well enough to let the absence be an absence rather than a narrative convenience. That quiet acknowledgement of loss, in a show that does not always take loss seriously, was its own kind of statement about value and meaning. These supporting characters, and the dozens of others who populate the world of Family Guy, contribute to the hidden story in the way that the background of a painting contributes to its foreground. Not as the primary subject, but as the context that makes the primary subject meaningful. The Griffins are who they are partly because of the world they move through. The Drunken Clam is not just a bar. The neighbors are not just plot devices. The town is not just a setting. They are all part of the same honest portrait of a specific kind of American life, and the portrait would not be complete without them.